My name is public, yet at the same time very private. I'm a Catholic priest living in the United States. You can call me Father Grey, or PadreyGrey, if you prefer. It was an old moniker amongst my close friends at the seminary, since I was sprouting silver locks on my scalp at the age of 22. The name didn't disseminate beyond the group, however, so it seems safe enough to use. If you find yourself recognizing me as you read through my stories, though, please keep things quiet. It's not that I fear any reprisal for giving out actual names, it's just generally frowned upon. You see, I'm currently the chief exorcist for my rather large diocese, and the names of exorcists are generally kept a secret. Now, Padre, you might think, surely that's a bit much. I can understand folks in the past blaming every bump in the night or every psychiatric episode on ghosts and demons, but a man in the 21st century, in the current year? Yes, my friends, in the current year. Not every bump in the night, of course. Carbon monoxide, settling houses, even infrasound phenomenon can explain quite a lot. Not every psychiatric episode either. I suppose much of this is common cultural knowledge at this point, since everyone loves a good ghost story, but the process of procuring a visit from me is staggering, to say the least. Psychological evaluations, physicians' visits, we even let skeptics tag along for objectivity. Admittedly, the pool of these narrows year by year. I have personally received about a dozen into the church following their experiences with me. The days of the local parish priest in the Middle Ages doubling as an exorcist are long gone, in part due to their zeal in diagnosing every random ailment as demonic activity. The church, at least as an entity, since I'm certain many of her hierarchy are functional atheists, take this seriously, and so do I. I suppose that's partly why I'm writing this. At a certain point, everyone must reckon with the events of their past, which made them who they are today. As I grow into my role, and grow even more gray, it seems that recounting my tales for the sake of permanence is something I have an obligation to do. So far, these have only been shared with my spiritual director. There are tales of possession, hauntings, and sheer human terror. But, and I firmly believe this, light always shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. So where to begin? Perhaps my first time. You never forget your first, they say. I was fresh out of seminary in the spring of 2008, newly ordained and arrived at my first parish assignment. The smell of chrism was still fresh on my hands, not even a day after arriving at St. Matthew's, a gorgeous suburban parish that looked suspiciously more like an office building than a church, which I was prepared to rough out for the next year or two. I received a call from the vicar for clergy. For those unaware of how church structure works, this is someone who works directly under the bishop to organize and keep tabs on all the priests in their diocese. His role is mostly figuring out which parishes to send clergy to, so my assumption was that he wanted to check in on my arrival. I clicked the answer button on my brick of a phone. Monsignor Phillips, a pleasure to hear from you.
Gray, hope you're settling into St. Matthew's well. How is Father David?
Father David was the pastor of St. Matthew's. Being a baby priest, as the newly ordained are called, I was only slated to be assigned as a parochial vicar, or, in more of an understandable term, an assistant pastor, for a few years until I had some experience under my belt. He's well enough, keeping busy. I'm looking forward to getting to know the place better.
Ah, well, about that.
He paused, and in his characteristic Joker style, he drew out the bombshell.
St. Matthew's may be a bustling soccer mom parish, but they are not in any need of a second priest.
Huh. So, am I taking up some kind of ministry while I'm living here?
No.
I don't quite get what you mean then, I said, confused.
Gray, his voice had suddenly developed a cold command. Bishop Joseph has been keeping some tabs on you for the past few years. He's been impressed with your academics, but above all, your spiritual development. Just keep this between us. The seminary described you as their most mature graduate in some years.
I was taken aback. Me? Spiritually mature? The idea seemed ludicrous. Sure, I had developed a solid schedule of prayer, being at Mass daily, and engaging in personal prayer, but it seemed like the other men were doing the same thing.
As you know, Monsignor Philip continued, interrupting my own thought process, The Holy Seat has been rather harshly coming down on American churches for its problems.
You don't have to tell me twice, I thought to myself.
To say nothing of the moral character of some of the clergy over the past decade. The Pope seems to have identified a more particular attitude of spiritual abandonment among the hierarchy here. Lack of piety, spiritual utilitarianism, modernism, the works. I knew very well the attitude that he mentioned. One of the practices we've been almost universally lax in is maintaining a group of diocese exorcists.
I didn't like the direction he was heading with this, not one bit.
Grey, you've been asked by the bishop to attend the Vatican's upcoming workshop on exorcism, and to consider accepting the charges as an exorcist of the diocese. Do you accept?
I felt a lump in my throat. Sure, one accepts the existence of the spiritual realm as a prerequisite for becoming a priest, but at the same time, did I really believe in it? Or rather, did I really believe I could handle it? Yet, with all these doubts swirling in my mind, the word came right out with almost no hesitation. Okay.
Good. Your address and technical assignment will remain at St. Matthew's for anonymity. Mail will be forwarded to you in Rome. Swing by my office tomorrow morning and we'll get everything underway. Until then, take care.
I pressed the end button on the phone and sat down to think. Now, you might be thinking this is where the story picks up. I assure you my time in Rome was less than eventful, though. I was there for a few months to attend classes and lectures, did a few practicums, heard some scary stories, was given a copy of The Rites of Exorcism, and was sent on a plane back home, scheduled to begin a new assignment with the only exorcist in our diocese. I began to wonder what I had even been nervous about. Then, I met Father Kelly. It was a cool autumn day when I arrived at St. Justine's, an old urban parish in a very large city with a reputation for being old school. The pastor had a reputation for being no nonsense, but a bit eclectic. He was lovingly referred to as Crazy Kelly, but only out of earshot. Parking my car on the street and sticking a few coins in the meter, I suddenly became aware of how imposing the facade of St. Justine's was. Tall, neo-Gothic spires, dark stone and brickwork, stained glass probably as old as the city itself. The rectory, situated to the left of the church itself, was much the same. I only picked up my suitcase from the car, figuring I'd score some special parish parking later to unload the rest of my luggage. I walked through the gates and approached the decrepit-looking archtop door, raising my hand to knock. Suddenly the door was opened with a drawn-out squeal as the figure of Father Kelly filled the space. He was older, in his 80s at the time, a bit shorter than me, probably 5'10", thin, slightly gaunt, but lively looking. His hair, far beyond mine, was properly silver. He wore vintage-looking half-moon spectacles, and was dressed in a priest's simplest and most characteristic attire, the black cassock.
"Grey, is it?"
He almost sounded excited, at least as much as a hoarse, elderly voice could.
"What an absolute pleasure."
He reached out his hand and grabbed mine, shaking the daylights out of me with a strength I wouldn't have expected from someone even half his age. "Father Kelly," I said, cordially straightening my posture and reciprocating the handshake. "Very nice to meet you as well."
"Oh, please,"
he said jovially, breaking the handshake and waving his hand in the door.
"I only make demons call me father. Drives 'em batshit."
Admittedly, I was taken off guard, but he continued walking through the foyer, waving me to continue through the very cozy living room. A brick fireplace provided glowing light and warmth. Cushioned chairs and the smell of books abounded. Despite his erratic personality, it was clean as a whistle.
"We're gonna be living together, so we'd best get a casual name basis going. I'll call you Grey if you like, and you can call me Kelly, or just CK."
He paused and glanced over his shoulder.
"Don't act like you don't know what that means."
He smiled and sat down in an old chair, motioning for me to take the opposite one. I sat down, placing my suitcase to my side. We exchanged some pleasantries, spoke about specifics regarding the parish, including the parking, which was conspicuously hidden in an alleyway behind the church itself, and then seemed to naturally gravitate to the topic at hand. "So, given what you said within a minute of greeting me, I take it that you're the current exorcist." CK laughed, giving a small but dramatic bow of his head.
"At your service, kid. Been at it for 50-odd years now. since around 1954. He paused and stared at the fire for a moment. Lots of changes. Lots stay the same.
He glanced at my suitcase.
Got a ritual in there?
I perked up. Yes, actually. They gave us one at the end of the program. I grabbed the suitcase and unbuckled it, handing him the book. Red hardcover, golden papal seal, embossed on the front. For a moment, I almost anticipated being able to give it some wear. CK curtly laughed.
Oh, Jesus, they're really making things hard on you guys.
He tossed the book casually into the fireplace, where it started to go up in flames. I jumped up, having a moment of panic as I wondered what sort of crazy Father Kelly actually was. But, I worked for months to get that, I stuttered, unsure what to do. CK had already stood up, walking me to a nearby bookshelf.
That ain't the ritual, kid.
I took a moment to collect myself. What do you mean? CK turned to me with a raised eyebrow, still thumbing through the bookshelf.
I mean, that ain't the ritual. When it comes to our line of work, Gray, what works is what works. I'll take what's been handed down to us by tradition over something drawn up in a committee meeting in the 70s? There it is.
He handed the book to me, and we sat back down. He kept silent, almost anticipating my desire to look through it. The Latin text, though slightly yellowed over time, was clearly discernible. The content was noticeably different, even to my amateur eye, from the book I had previously been given.
We can wax philosophy about the nature of changing times later, but suffice to say, the book you had wasn't worth its weight in salt. This is the real deal. This is what works.
I gave him a short nod.
So, ready for your first assignment?
He said, almost giddily jumping up. I was almost shocked at the delivery. I just got here, and I'm not even familiar with this new book.
Oh no, nothing like that. Just a sort of character assignment. Come into the office and I'll give you the details.
For the sake of brevity, I won't tell you the entirety of our conversation. Perhaps also for the sake of the person in question as well. CK had been apprised of a potential case by the bishop's office, although the details were not entirely clear yet. No evaluation had been done, but something about the case, and he would not elaborate on what, led to the bishop to ask CK to investigate it first.
I'm a bit old for this investigation stuff, or rather, I'm old enough that young blood should get the chance to shine, CK said with a little laugh.
The assignment was simple. Visit an apartment in Chinatown, evaluate a 25-year-old man, and report my findings back to CK.
Nothing too complicated. Just visit, talk with the family, evaluate the patient, write down some observations, and come back here to see me. I'll keep the lights on for you.
And so, off I went. It was evening at this point, and the reflectiveness of the city's buildings made golden hour particularly beautiful. I almost doubted what my work was, even as I drove up to the otherwise normal-looking apartment building, and felt something hollow in my stomach. I parked my car on the curb, getting out and fumbling with putting my keys in the pocket of my own black cassock, worn now as CK had insisted. The uniform, he called it. Before I could even get to the door of the tall, brutalist apartment building, an Asian family had opened it, congregating on the stoop and staring at me. 2 men, similar looking enough to be brothers, 2 women, probably their wives, a handful of children and adults of various ages. I slowed my walk a bit, taking in their expressions. They were dressed nicely, almost too nicely for home. The women had their makeup done, the men had combed their hair, but it was all a veneer. Underneath they looked exhausted, faces flushed, eyes red or glazed over, and their expressions somewhere between hopeless and longing. I stood on the sidewalk in front of them. I'm Father Grey. I'm here to call on someone? The oldest looking man just stared at me, opening and closing his mouth for a few minutes. "No," came the voice of one of the women, blue eyeshadow concealing dark bags around her eyes. "We knew in America, Catholic." She pulled a rosary from her pocket, smiling as she showed it to me. I smiled back and relied on body language to get me where I needed to be. I gestured myself through the door, and the men led me up the stairs while the rest of the group remained on the stoop.
After climbing a handful of stories, he paused, pulling out a key and unlocking an apartment door. We walked inside. There were signs of life, dinner on the table, TV playing. It seemed, at least at the time, that they had somehow known of my arrival. The windows of the apartment faced a different street, though, so I couldn't make sense of the notion. They led me through the apartment, down a hallway to a door. I noticed the single feature marking it apart from the other doors, an exterior padlock. The older man went to unlock it before being suddenly stopped by the younger. They spoke for a moment in their native language. Finally, the younger beckoned me. "Benedicta," he said. "Benedict vos blessing?" It seemed opportune, so I made the sign of the cross and imparted his request. "Benedict vos omnipus Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus." The men signed themselves. The older proceeded to unlock the door. They both backed away and seemed to anticipate my entry with fear. I rotated the knob and pushed in the door. Immediately, the air hit me. Hot, roasting hot, damp and dismal. The smell. My God, the smell. Like a rotting carcass, sickly sweet and pervasive, putting your body in a state of alarm. Ammonia stung my nostrils. Were it not for my higher faculties, I would have instantly fled. The windows had been blacked out, and I could barely make out the form of a bed in the center of the room. I flipped the light switch. Before me was the immensity of human suffering, the likes of which I had never seen. On this bed was a man, or the form of a man, bound in chains and hardly discernible. His sweat-soaked skin, gray as stone, was marked with open sores. The sheets were stained with blood, feces, and urine, and he was looking right at me. He just stared. It was like looking at a doll or some other lifeless object, something so realistically human, and yet not. An uncanny valley. It was terrifying, and in the depths of my soul, I felt as if I needed to flee this place. My muscles seemed to burn with fear. My skin radiated chills up and down my entire body, and I stared into the face of something which every ounce of my unconscious mind warned me was only pretending to be human. I approached the bed, his eyes following me, bloodshot and brown, but with the unusual piercing pupils. I stood next to him, every ounce of my willpower keeping me from running and retching. I'm not sure how long we did this, but I know that I didn't blink in the entirety of it. Finally, his cold and lifeless stare took on life. His lips, deep purple and cracked, seemed to twitch. Was he speaking? Trying to speak? I held my silence and listened. I watched his face slowly contort into a wildly demented smile, chapped lips making small rips as the skin stretched. His teeth began to show, with the gum lines so worn down as not to be visible. It was entirely unnatural. The entire time, neither of us blinked. Then he whispered, "Grey." I blinked. A wicked, powerful crackling soared through his body. He was laughing at me, and it felt as if every dark deed of my life had been surfaced for the world to see. Every fear, every torment, every doubt. He cackled like some wild animal as my innermost being was laid bare. "Grey, Grey, Grey." He began shouting my name, screaming it. Beyond the voice itself were dozens of others, voices upon voices filled with hate and malice in the midst of their mockery. It was as if a chorus of fear was calling me to my basest instincts. "Grey, Grey, Grey." I turned and ran, the door of the room slamming behind me, as every instinct in my mind suddenly kicked into gear. I ran down the steps, out the door, and to my car. Even as I sat, fumbling for the keys, I could hear his unholy chorus screaming in my ears, "Grey! Grey! Grey!" Ignition. Gear. Gas. Drive. 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 I ran on instinct for miles, booking it back to St. Justine's. The sun had set, and in the darkness of the night, I ran from my car to the door of the darkening rectory, slamming it shut behind me and heading straight for the kitchen while turning on every light I could. I'm not ashamed to say that I vomited. I was absolutely beside myself with fear, anxiety, and worry. I needed some respite. I needed a break. I slowly managed to walk to the living room, collapsing into the same chair I had sat in a few hours before. And I just breathed, closed my eyes and cried, and prayed, and wondered how in hell I could have chosen this position. And then I realized that CK had not left the lights on for me. My eyes shot open, taking in the faint light around me, adrenaline pumping through my body. Where was Father Kelly? I paused for a moment, slowly standing up. Something wasn't right. I had turned the lights on, but something was off about them. I studied the room, the walls, the lamps. It was all as if viewing it through sunglasses. They were shining, but so dimly, so softly. Suddenly, fear shot into my heart. A noise rang through my head, piercing my ears and making my chest and shoulders feel as if they would burst. An explosion almost, or just a complete overwhelming of my auditory nerves. Whatever it was, it sent the animal part of my brain haywire. I felt as if I were in the sight of a predator, and there was no escape. I turned to face the door, suddenly making out the form of a massive beastly shadow. More than a shadow, just the sheer absence of light itself, like looking into death and darkness in a being, in an animal. It approached. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it just came towards me with a beastly energy of undescribable hate and malice, casting itself up, lumbering over to me. And all I could hear, all I could think, was the chorus of voices from that apartment. Gray, Gray, Gray! I fell to the floor screaming, God! Oh God, please! And in the deepness of my despair and fear, in his own small way, he seemed to answer. I heard the door of the rectory come flying open. Behind the shadow, I could barely discern the figure of Father Kelly coming into view, crucifix in hand, divine confidence making him appear almost youthful. It was the last moment of consciousness that I heard him, in a voice more commanding than any I had heard before. Oh no! No, no! No, you don't! Not here! Not in my fucking house! Blackness. Silence. 1,000 dark, twisted dreams soared through my mind. Tortured souls, miserable events, and an overbearing dread which colored the timeless sleep I found myself in. I seemed to be a visitor, a passerby in these visions. More than visions, really. They were just inferred reality. It was as if I could not comprehend their true content and still live. In the midst of this experience, I suddenly became aware of myself, and in a moment, I was catapulted into consciousness. My eyes shot open, staring up at the wooden beam ceiling. The faint sound of the bedside fan hummed in my ear, whispering cool air past my face. Against the wall sat my luggage, still packed. On the wall, a simple analog clock read 11. The comforter I laid under was warm, homey. I could faintly smell toasted bread. Did that really happen? I asked myself, bringing my hands up to my face and wiping the sleep from my eyes. Was the man in the apartment real? Was the attack in the rectory? Was it all just some hellish nightmare? I sat up, feeling uncharacteristically refreshed, and took my bearings. The room was large, furnished in the same Victorian accents, almost neo-Gothic style, as the rest of the house. I was wearing the t-shirt and gym shorts which I had on under my cassock on the previous night. On the baseboard, my black socks and cassock were folded over neatly. I threw off the comforter and put my feet on the floor. Cool, storied hardwood greeted me. My strength, which seemed to have abandoned me in the midst of my horror the night before, had returned in full. I exited the room, finding myself on the upstairs floor of the rectory. Beside me was a short hallway with a handful of other rooms, including one with a hanging wooden plaque faintly marked Kelly. I looked back at my door and saw Gray printed there. Across from my door was a staircase, which led me down to the same hallway as CK's office. I wasn't sure what else was on the first floor, save for the dining room and the kitchen beside the spacious living room I had been in yesterday. Despite its impressive structure from the outside, the rectory was modest, not small, but compact. So far, I had seen 2 floors, each of which had only had a handful of rooms connecting to a short hallway. I walked down towards the kitchen where I could hear, smell, and almost taste the cacophony of cooking. CK had his back to me as I rounded the archway, stirring something in a frying pan. My stomach suddenly rumbled at the scent of breakfast. Bacon, eggs, toast.
"Gray," CK said, happy without missing a beat. "Glad to see you've joined me here in the land of the living."
He turned his head for just a moment, revealing a smile laden with friendly sarcasm, before getting back to cooking. I sat down at the table, dishes already laid out for our meal.
"I suppose you're gonna want some explanation about last night. But if we get into it without some breakfast, you might just pass out on me again."
He clicked off the burner, grabbing the pan and walking over to me.
"I hope you like your eggs scrambled and your bacon crispy. Not much of a cook, but I can do the basics well enough."
He laughed and scooped a hefty amount of breakfast onto my plate. He did the same to his plate before grabbing 2 pieces of toast, one for each of us, and sitting down across the table from me. I expected some long-winded blessing, perhaps in Latin, given his own inclinations, but his idea of saying grace was quite abrupt. A quick sign of the cross over our table, and a short prayer.
"God, thank you for giving us food. Bless the workers who brought it to us. Bless all those that we, being sustained by it, will encounter today. Amen."
So we ate. Despite my own inner confusion, I found myself absolutely devouring what was in front of me. I was ravenous, as if I hadn't eaten in days. At a certain point, I realized that I had gotten through my entire plate, while CK wasn't even partly finished with his. I sheepishly looked up from the table, and encountered his bright smile.
"I suppose you'd like to know what made you so famished, huh?"
I chuckled, still caught off guard by his candor. Well, I'm still trying to figure out what really happened. I mean, it seemed like I don't know, it existed in a foggy memory. It's like
a dream?" he interrupted.
Exactly like a dream. Or maybe a nightmare.
"Many would say the later, kid. Suffice to say, it wasn't either. Not properly speaking, at least."
I paused, letting the weight of his truth impact me.
"It was all real, kid. From the moment you left this rectory to the moment you fell to the ground crying."
So, I tried to gather my thoughts before speaking. The apartment? The man?
"Well, I only had a report to go on, but unless you encountered some insane coincidence, I'd say it was as real as it gets."
I felt relief, but behind that a sense of frustration, possibly even anger. How had Kelly allowed me, with no experience, to walk into such a situation? Why had he not come with me? And how had that entity followed me back? I must have been visibly stressed, because CK's next words were laden with comfort.
"You didn't do anything wrong."
My eyes met his, and he had a look of genuine concern on his face.
"You did exactly what I told you to do, and got a result which will expedite this whole thing."
What was it?" I asked, exasperation clinging to my words.
Kelly thought for a moment. "It was Legion, which is what the report indicated."
He set down his silverware, leaning back and setting his hands on his lap, contemplating his explanation.
"A week or so ago, the bishop received a report from St. Xiaorong Parish. Father Liang had a parishioner exhibiting some classic signs of possession, and a family on the brink. They had a psych eval, of course, but he was mostly unresponsive. Something about the signs, though."
He trailed off for a moment.
There are different types of possession, kid. I'm sure you know that."
We covered it. Oppression, obsession, and possession, right?
"Well, not exactly. Those are 3 manifestations of demonic involvement. I'm talking about the third, the different type of possession itself."
I drew a blank, and CK could tell.
"There's the more classical case, individual possession. One demon which infests one's soul, impacting the world around it, and trying to bring about as much chaos as possible. There's even objectual possession, infestation, when the demon somehow takes hold on a physical object and lashes out from there. But in all these cases, you're still dealing with a single spirit, one obnoxious twat trying to tear down the world around it. I chuckled, appreciating the effortless humor he laced into his conversation. While there are different subtypes, this was not a case of individual possession. This was a legion, a multiple possession. Multiple demons infecting the same person, using their combined efforts to bring about as much destruction as they collectively could. The family, they're not after the guy, they're trying to wear down the family, I said, suddenly putting things together. Exactly, CK continued, leaning forward in his chair, his hoarse voice taking on a palpable seriousness. A legion isn't out to possess one individual for the hell of it. They're out to cause mayhem to as many people as possible. In this case, they tear down the physical and mental well-being of the family, drive them to the brink, destroy their faith, and if they can, lead them to death. I contemplated his words, letting the weight settle over me. So, what followed me back? Oh, that! That was what I was counting on sending you. You see, if I had gone in there, it would have been an obnoxious game of cat and mouse. They would have picked up on my identity in a heartbeat and laid low, trying everything in their power to make this case seem like a tragedy of natural circumstances. I needed to be sure this was a legion. Unfortunately, they know me too well. But they knew my name. Oh, that's what they wanted you to believe, he said with an almost scoff. Great tricksters, these things. They didn't know you from Adam until you entered that room and let your guard down. One of the things we'll have to work on is fortitude, but that's always the case with new exorcists. Demons can't just steal everything out of your head. They're not magicians. They can pick up on big picture realities, including your identity, and that's the easiest way to freak somebody out. He paused for a moment, letting the air hang with anticipation, before sticking his hands up and clawing in a cartoonish monster impression. "Grey! Grey!" he laughed, slapping his thigh. I was dumbstruck, to say the least. "Kid, it's all about the optics of fear. You got followed home because one of the Legion decided you might be an easy target for individual possession. Apparently, that indelible mark on your soul from the ordination wasn't enough to keep it away, or maybe it was too dumb to notice. You do get that sometimes. Demon can be as stupid as a box of rocks when they're self-absorbed in their convictions. So, it followed you home and decided to start with the oppression. And you put a stop to it. Well, I was waiting in the church for your arrival, saying my prayers, you know, priest things. But when I felt it, that undescribable sense which you will attune to over time, I knew. So I came back out, just in time, apparently. I stared down at my plate for a moment, contemplating everything he had explained. So, is it gone? I began. Did you take care of it? Oh yes, no problems there. It was a nobody. Sent him packing with a few minor exorcism prayers and some, harsh language, he chuckled. I laughed, finally feeling some levity in my heart. What do we do now? Well, considering you've been asleep for 3 days. 3 days? I jumped out of my chair, shocked. CK started cackling again, and I realized I'd been had. Oh, kid, I'm messing with you. You had a single night's rest. I stuck you upstairs, folded up your cassock, and said a few minor exorcisms over you, just in case. You're fine. Hopefully, we can't say the same for the Legion that I'll be taking care of this afternoon. I sat back down, laughing myself. It's going to take me some time to get used to your humor, CK. Ha, time we've got, but not much of it. Daily Mass is in half an hour. Go get dressed now and sit in the congregation. You ought to get to know the people who are going to be calling you Padre.
We got up with very little fanfare. CK washed dishes as I started my own morning routine. Mass, too, proceeded with very little fanfare, although highly attended for noon on a Friday. The church itself was beautiful, with arches and features exemplifying the time period of its construction. The jewel of the sanctuary was a large marble high altar with a beautiful reredos covered in statuary. Like most things relating to CK, his mass was old school as well, all in Latin, except for the readings, celebrating with no obnoxious alliterations or personal liberties. Throughout the liturgy, there was an air of real reverence to the place. He seemed to disappear into the rite, as C.S. Lewis would have put it, and his signature attitude was hardly noticeable, except for a few moments of humor in his preaching. I was able to compliment the altar boys on their skills at serving the Mass, and speak with a few families, all of which were thrilled to see me. There seemed to be a high regard for CK, to the point that almost everyone had something similar to say. "I owe Father Kelly so much," said Brandon, a 20-something with his wife and 3 children tagging along. "Father Kelly changed my life. Truly changed it," beamed Allison, attending Mass with her newborn, while her husband watched the rest of the family at home. "I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for that man," explained Razi, a middle-aged Palestinian immigrant. CK caught up with me afterwards, having put away his vestment. "Feeling up to the task again," he said with a smirk. "I take it we have some unfinished business?" "Unfinished business. I like that. Good trope." He gave me a light elbow to the side, walking towards the door. "Say some personal prayers if you like. We're heading right over. Doctor gets there at 2 o'clock. The next hour seemed to fly by. CK and I, already wearing our cassocks, packed white surplices and ornate violet stoles in our briefcases. Each of us brought a copy of the rite, although CK assured me he would be the one doing the exorcism himself. Then we hit the road, CK in the driver's seat, ready to make our appointment. As we drove up to the imposing complex, I could see the same family waiting on the stoop, though not bothering with the veneer of normalcy which they had tried to give off the day before. They looked properly disheveled, exhausted, pitiful. As CK parked, I felt my stomach go hollow again, a tinge of fear overcoming me. He seemed to sense this, looking over at me with a fatherly affection. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "In the world you have tribulations, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." He gave me a firm pat and reached to open his door, exiting the car and walking over to the family. I followed, somehow imbued with a new confidence. From behind me, I heard a nasally, grating voice. "So you must be the priest I'm working with." I turned around. Walking towards me was a short, middle-aged man. He had a white polo and khaki Bermuda shorts, and seemed on the cusp of being out of breath. "Ah, you must be Dr. Mangrove," he answered, sticking out a sweaty hand for me to shake. "Harold Mangrove, D.O. I work at the university across town." He broke our handshake and glanced back at CK, who seemed to be actually engaging the family in conversation. "I ain't never done nothing like this before. I mean, this possession stuff. I ain't exactly a believer, you know." "In what?" I asked. "Anything, really." "Well," I assured him, "I'm not sure what I believe about all this myself, so hopefully that puts you in good company." He seemed startled by my statement as I walked over to CK. "Doctor's here. Should we start?" I asked. "Oh, yes," CK replied, breaking away from his own conversation. "The sooner, the better." We walked back to the car, putting on our vestments and grabbing our books. CK carried a bottle of holy water in one hand, his bookmarked ritual in the other. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Harold looking on with a smirk at the show. Finally, after checking that Harold had all his supplies, we walked back to the stoop and were brought up into the apartment by the same brother who had led us yesterday. As we ascended each story, I could feel my heart begin to beat faster. I became increasingly aware of all my surroundings. Behind me, I could hear Harold gasping for air. We entered the apartment complex and walked straight to the padlocked room. As we approached, CK suddenly stopped me. "The doctor will need to go first. We can't proceed unless the patient is stable," he said. Harold cut past us both, still catching his breath as he pulled a few supplies out of his bag. Father imparted a blessing of the habit, the 2 brothers signing themselves before the older took out his key. I seemed to vicariously relive my own experience, watching Harold's reaction as the door opened. He was less than tactful, however, immediately gagging and coughing as he meandered into the room. We stayed out of sight, the 2 brothers standing guard at the doorway, with faces made of stone. "Ah," came the serpentine voice from inside. "Doctor." CK and I looked at each other, and he gave a short tap of his temple. Fortitude, I thought. Had to maintain my fortitude. From inside the room, We could hear Harold's observation. Blood pressure, heart rate, temperature. He rattled off numbers under his breath. Can you hear me, buddy? My name is Dr. Mangrove, and I'm here to help. Can you hear me? Silence. How are you feeling? Silence. After a few moments, Harold walked out. He was drenched in sweat, pale, and looking like half the man he was before. He's been through some shit, but he ain't unstable. Not yet. We ain't leaving here with him chained up like that, though. I understand that different folks got different responses to crazies, but you's gotta understand, this guy needs to be taken somewhere when you're done. Non-negotiable. You can say your prayers and blessings, but anything changes, I'm calling this in. CK nodded and turned to me, beckoning me to go first. I nervously followed his lead. The atmosphere of the room was just as bad as the previous day, if not worse. The stink of rot, the sting of ammonia. My adrenaline shot through the roof as soon as I saw the man lying in the bed. The fear was not at present, at least not that it burned in my muscles, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins was entirely uncontrollable. Once again, my unconscious mind was face to face with the inhuman. Immediately a twisted smile came over his face, and that hellish chorus began to scream my name. Another chorus of wicked, cackling screams overlaid on it. Grey! Grey! CK entered the doorway, coming into view. He walked past me with an extraordinary command, a look of righteous zeal on his face. In an instant, the cries of the man ceased, replaced by a look of terror and shock. Silence, creature! CK bellowed, sprinkling holy water across the room. Any discernible words were replaced by insane, damned screams of torment, a chorus of hundreds, if not thousands. CK sprinkled himself with holy water, followed by me. We opened our rites. The following minutes were a blur. I made the liturgical responses, as CK powerfully commanded the demon to depart, his perfect Latin accentuated by the accent of divine pleading. My own was rusty, but still confident. Et clamor muus ad te venit, et cut spiritus tuo, sed liberum nos e malo, amen. The creature on the bed writhed in agony, pulling at the chains which bound it. My mind couldn't even conceive of this being a man anymore. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Harold standing transfixed. The room itself began to grow cold, deadly cold. The lights, previously bright and stark, began to dim as if viewed through a dark glass. Just like night, it seemed as if every shadow, every hidden area was crawling with hellish monsters. I felt watched from every side. Vade, CK cried, raking the crucifix in the air. Vade ratro santana. The room was consumed in a chorus of screaming, inky blackness overcoming all shreds of light. CK continued even in the midst of the darkness, his memory serving him. I could sense the entities present with us, like one might sense eyes in the back of their head. Untold numbers of monstrous beasts encircled us, and waited for an opportunity to strike. They expressed pure, absolute hatred. There was no doubt or second thought in their mind. They hated us, and wanted us dead with every fiber of their being. I remember CK's words. Fortitude. I tried with all my might to hold on to my sanity, if nothing else. CK's voice roared across the demonic noise, oppressing the room. Adjure te sepernus antique. Suddenly, light. It was as if I had suddenly come into being then and there, surrounded by stark, bright light of the beginning of the universe. It was almost overwhelming until my eyes came into focus. CK stood over the man, his hand extended. His ritual had wound up on the floor at some point. Harold was sitting on the ground, appearing to be in a state of shock. As I looked before me, all I could see was the poor man, contorted in some unnatural way. His face writhed in agony, bound up between limbs, chains, and appendages. The chorus of screams, which I realized my mind had blocked out due to their constant drone, had grown to a level which made me cover my ears. CK remained, hand extended, calmly speaking the exorcism. It was a sight unlike anything I've ever seen. Suddenly, a great force like a gust of wind forced us backward. I fell onto the floor, and on the other side of the bed I could see the same thing happening to CK. The chorus of screams suddenly faded into one, which then became a single, sad whimper. CK quickly rushed to his feet as I followed. On the bed was the man, still chained and covered in sores and bruises, but crying in a confused, pitiful way. CK looked at him. A wave of relief seemed to cover his face. I did the same. Nothing uncanny. I turned and beckoned the two brothers to come in, helping them to untie the chains which had kept the man secure to the bed. They all embraced in a hug, tears flowing. Across the room, CK picked up his ritual and wiped sweat from his brow. I approached him, feeling weak myself. "A success?" I asked. "It would seem," he weakly replied, "but all successes necessitate thanksgiving. I'm going to finish the post-exorcism prayers myself. You take him," he gestured towards Harold, sitting on the floor in the stupor, "and go let the family know. Wait for me outside." I got Harold up, still in a daze, and we walked outside. The family burst into cries and tears of joy when I gave them the good news, delivered with a smile and a nod, a universal gesture. As they all ran inside, I took off my vestment, folding them and putting them back in the briefcase. I joined Harold on the stoop. Unfortunately, Harold's story ends here for the moment. He sat stupefied for quite some time, alternating between weeping and staring at nothing. Finally, he got up, waved a half-hearted goodbye, and walked back the way he had came. As I sat outside, looking up at the sunset and considering the events of the day, I had my own moment of thanksgiving. I heard the door open behind me and turned to see CK walking out, disheveled but living. He made a beeline for the car, still wearing his vestments. He quickly took them off and tossed them into the back, waving me over. "You drive," he said, tossing me the keys, and it seemed the least I could do. The ride home was quiet. He seemed to be in a mix of exhaustion and meditation. When we finally got back to the rectory and walked through the front door, he seemed to have a moment of realization. "Oh, Gray, you have business to attend to." He walked into the living room and grabbed the phone off the wall. "Business? What business?" I asked. "You sat in on my mass at the parish today, but you haven't celebrated your own. That's a non-negotiability in our field. One of the altar boys, Jude, is a couple of houses down. One of the Hendersons. I believe you met his dad today, Brandon." I recalled the meeting and nodded to CK. "Good folks. I'll call Brandon and see if Jude can come over to serve a private mass for you in the parish. In the future, we can work out a schedule." I set my briefcase down and tried to collect myself while CK made the call. All things considered, the rest of the evening went smoothly. Jude and Brandon knocked on our door a few minutes later and happily introduced themselves again. We walked across to the church, where I celebrated a private mass, Jude excellently serving, and Brandon observing from the back of the church with a look of fatherly pride. Throughout my liturgy, as I prayed, the feeling of anxiety and terror slowly abated. As I prayed, the words of the canon, invoking the aid of all the saints and angels in their solemn work, I felt an overwhelming sense of righteousness, calling on the aid of heavenly spirits rather than casting out hellish ones. A half hour later, I said good night to both of them, tipping Jude $5 for his trouble, and made my way across to the rectory. It was dark and quiet. CK had apparently gone to bed. I made my own way upstairs and to my bedroom, ready for a deep sleep. Then, sitting on my pillow, I saw a scribbled note. Sunday, 2 p.m., Evolution. See you in the AM with details.
Angelus Domine non viat Maria, et concepti de Spiritu Sanctum, Ave Maria, grate plene. Almost on cue, the iron bell of St. Justine began to ring the 6 a.m. Angelus. I had beaten it by a mere 10 seconds. Esse ancile Domine, fiat mihi, sectum verbedum tum, Ave Maria, grate plene. I pulled back the comforter and sat up, resting my feet on the warm wooden floor. The sky was dark, but seemed to be slowly lightening up with each second as the sun raced on its steady track. Et verbum caro factum est, et habitabit in nobis, Ave Maria, grate plene. I stood up, stretching as I concluded the Angelus prayer, always my first of the day. Warmth of the floor inevitably meant CK had started a fire in the wood stove. I made my way downstairs to see if I could return the favor by fixing our breakfast. I was in luck to accomplish my good deed, as I could see CK sitting in the living room next to the lively roaring fire.
half dozing off while reading a book. I chuckled to myself as I debated waking him, but figured the smell of a good breakfast would be a more pleasing way to wake up than your associate exorcist tapping you on the shoulder. I made my way to the kitchen and started working on the great bulwark of all breakfastum: bacon, eggs, potatoes, with a lot of coffee to boot. Father Kelly and I had been working together for about a month at this point. The fervor of my arrival had abated, with the case of the possessed man in Chinatown I had associated with being my hit so far. There had been a few investigations in the time since, interviews and the like, including the rather ominous note which I described at the end of the previous tale. But, as is often the case, they turned out to be easily explainable. An emotive Italian grandmother, convinced her pantry was being destroyed by the devil, turned out to be a nest of rats. A young college student who had seemingly lost the will to live, and whose parents noticed fresh injuries on him every morning, turned out to be just a case of clinical depression. We even investigated a series of frantic messages left on the church's answering machine, and realized they were coming from a psychiatric care home for schizophrenia by a man who claimed to be Jesus, who just needed a little help exorcising his live-in nurse. Each of these cases certainly merited prayers and mass intentions on our part, and a referral to someone else, be it a doctor or an exterminator, but certainly not an exorcist. And it occurred to me that sometime in the space of that month, there was a clear logic in keeping an exorcist involved in normal parish ministry. Staying grounded in normal pastoral ministry genuinely seemed to refresh CK between cases. His relationship with the members of the parish was genuine, a stellar example of real spiritual fatherhood, which priests are supposed to embody. I began to realize that many of the parishioners had some story to tell about CK, how he had encountered them in different circumstances, and somehow changed their lives for the better, but they hadn't quite gotten around to giving me the details of those stories. However, I was most excited by how welcoming everyone had been to me so far. As those thoughts stirred through my head, I recalled another feeling which had been steadily growing since I woke up. I felt like today, an otherwise beautiful Saturday morning, was going to bring another investigation with it. The night before, CK had received a phone call from the chantry, the office where the bishop works, for those unfamiliar. I figured it might be mundane parish matters, but I saw CK put on his serious face quite quickly. That usually only came out when he needed to take in details from a potential case, a tell I had learned pretty early on. Before taking the rest of the call in his private study, he simply told me, "You might want to turn in early." My contemplation was interrupted by the sound of CK's footsteps coming into the kitchen. He looked a bit disheveled from his nap in the chair, but otherwise rested. "Smells like a feast of heaven on earth in here," he said, his voice excited. "Oh, indeed. Come to the table of plenty," I said. He chuckled and sat down as I poured him the first fruits of the coffee pot, and set a plate in front of him adorned with crispy bacon, over-easy eggs, and fried potatoes. I did the same for myself and joined him at the table, providing the blessing for our feast before we dug in. "I suppose you'll be wanting the news?" CK plainly asked, crunching down on a slice of bacon. I laughed as I sipped coffee. "I'm all ears." Business was no cause for CK slowing down, as he recounted our newest assignment between bites of food. "Yesterday's call was from the bishop himself, surprisingly." I was taken aback. Normally a case call would come from his assistant in the chantry, the vicar general, or some old deacon doing office work in his retirement. CK, of course, could seemingly read my thoughts by the look on my face. "That's right, kid. It's looking like it might be the real deal. Bizarre case details, too. Apparently the chantry's been getting near endless phone calls for a few days from Lavender McCoy." Seeing the confusion on my face, he stopped for a moment. "I keep forgetting you knew. Lavender McCoy owns Lavender's Esoterica, one of those shops that sells crystals and shit to alternative kids trying to find their inner sun goddess." I tried unsuccessfully to stifle a chuckle. "But, despite the vast majority of her clientele being made up of that sort, she does cater to a genuine occult interest as well. I'm not sure how much stock she really puts in all of it, but anyone around here dealing with the occult and needing supplies, herbs and books and the like, they all go to her." "So, she's had some change of heart?" "Now hang on a second.
I'm still in the middle of a story. So last night the bishop is walking back to his residence at the cathedral when who does he see waiting at his door but Lavender McCoy, and not exactly in a change of heart mood either.
She wasn't trying to start something, was she?
No, nothing like that. She was distraught, actually. Said through gritted teeth that she normally wouldn't give a damn to speak 2 words to me. Her words, of course. But there wasn't nobody else that she felt could approach this. Well, suffice to say, it was something in our purview. That's about it.
I paused for a moment. So, nothing else? No case information?
Of course not. CK rolled his eyes as he finished his last bite of eggs. God knows why she went all the way to the middle of downtown to harass the bishop. Her little tchotchke shop is just down the way, and we've run into each other more than once.
What are we supposed to do then?
On the rare occasion that the bishop himself has to pass something on to me directly, he likes to play a little game of detective. Never gives me a word about the case itself, has me investigate the claimant, get the story, and then compare it with his own reports to see if it matches before anything gets rolling. Apparently, putting 1 extra cog in the paperwork machine is his price for being bothered.
CK stood up, giving me a firm pat on the shoulder as he walked his dishes over to the sink.
Get your uniform on, Gray. We're heading out to Lavender's Esoterica.
As we closed the formidable front door of the rectory, the sun had just come over the horizon to illuminate an uncharacteristically warm October morning. Though urban, the neighborhood which St. Justine's occupies was a few blocks short of any particularly tall buildings, meaning that we were always able to bask in that initial morning glory. Another benefit of our location was that driving was only a factor in some cases, which took us beyond our, or rather CK's, walking ability. Though elderly, he was quite spry, and for as short a trip as this was, he had balked the recommendation of a car. Lavender's store was about half an hour away on foot, and CK insisted that we walk it, for his health, of course. In seminary, we had often received admonitions for wearing clerical attire in public. Certainly some of the older clergy were averse to it, because it wasn't welcoming the thoughts of a particular generation, but even some of the younger instructors maintained that it could get us targeted for harassment, or simply made an open book for solicitation by riffraff. The sight of a priest in clerical attire, never mind the distinctive cassock, had been a rarity for some decades. CK, of course, was insistent on it. A flock needs to see their shepherd, he would say to me, and to see him they did. He wore the same black cassock as I did, but carried a gentlemanly old-world touch with it, a black and silver walking stick, which he certainly didn't need, and a fine black Tyrolean hat. Despite his discouraged manner of dress, CK certainly made a good reputation for himself in the neighborhood. Though in a poorer area of town, and certainly not bustling with Catholics, the few people we encountered walking the streets or sitting on their stoops greeted him by name. "CK, what's good, my man?"
"Father, and another father. Say they ain't gonna put you out to pasture, are they?"
"Morning, Padre." It was somewhat inspiring, if a bit amusing to say the least. CK's mood was contemplative as we walked. He was usually like this just prior to a visitation, mulling about the possibilities and calling on high for some aid. I tried to do the same, but this all being new to me, I found myself continuously distracted by my own worries. It had been weeks since my harrowing encounter at the apartment across the city, but I could not shake the experience. These things had gone from being hypotheticals in my head, things which I certainly believed but had never experienced, to being as real as the autumn sun currently bearing down on us. How, I thought to myself, am I supposed to fit this into my normal life? Lost in thought, I had hardly noticed as the buildings began to occupy more and more space. Before us, I could see the cityscape still some distance away, with buildings slowly reaching further into the heavens as they approached downtown. CK came to a stop and pointed catty-corner to us, where, among various other storefronts, was an exotic-looking shop bedecked with Gothic decor. The white lettering on the large window read, "Lavender's Esoterica." Inside, I could barely make out the figure of a woman sitting at a table near the window, drinking out of a mug and looking out at us.
"Saves us the trouble of waking her up, I suppose," CK whispered.
Let's not keep her waiting then. Gray, this woman may just be putting her toes in the water, but she's involved in some very serious business, even if she doesn't entirely know it. She's also a rather unique individual. Let me lead here, okay? CK began walking across the street with an energetic purpose, taking off his hat and handing it back to me as I caught up. The door of the shop opened just as we stepped onto the sidewalk, and Lavender McCoy walked out. She was a woman in her mid-30s, it seemed, and evenly proportioned. Her hair was jet black with streaks of purple dyed in, matching what appeared to be the remnants of makeup on her exhausted face. Lavender, Father Grey and I are here to follow up on your discussion with Bishop Joseph. She gave me a very obvious once-over, her tone filling with skepticism. Young Father Grey at that. If it weren't for the hair, I'd say he was trying to skip class at Holyrood Academy by pretending to be a priest. You know me, CK responded with an air of humor, always trying to help the needy. Lavender gave a faint smile. Yes, I do know you, which is precisely why I wanted to avoid getting you involved. If word gets out that you're in my shop for more than a few minutes, most of my regulars are going to think I've baptized their tarot cards. Probably best if we come inside then, lest anyone get the wrong idea. Lavender sighed and ushered us in, locking the door behind us and drawing the few curtains she had. Inside of Lavender's esoterica, you could smell the faint aroma of incense, though not exactly the variety one might use at Mass. It was earthy and herbal, with the old wood of the building and the shelves of books providing its own unique musk. She had an assortment of occult and New Age goods on display, beautiful rocks and gems, crystals of all varieties, charms, hunks of herbs, the aforementioned shelves of books. A few tables and chairs lay scattered around the room, including one with a decorative crystal ball. As Lavender arranged a few chairs just out of view of the window, she noticed my curious glance. Looking to take up scrying in your spare time? I looked back at her, catching the faint smirk on her face. Even CK seemed to take some amusement from the question, literally anticipating her behavior. Somehow the realization that I was indeed a priest, standing around an occult shop, managed to suddenly befuddle me. Just appreciating your, ball. Young Father Grey is still rather new to the field. I haven't quite gotten him as far as the mechanics of your esoterica. Lavender laughed, pulling out a final chair for me and motioning me to sit down. Not sure that I buy the scrying, but it brings in the clients for Madame Dobroska's clairvoyance every Wednesday. Lavender's face suddenly became serious. Seances with the dead every Friday, too. She broke into a laugh, seeming to reveal how uncomfortable I probably appeared. CK seemed able to see through the facade of humor and got right to the point. Lavender, I know something is troubling you. I can see you're exhausted. We're not here to cast any judgment on your store or your craft or your clients. We just want to help. CK looked over at me. Taking a cue, I reassured her. Miss Lavender, please, tell us what happened. Lavender took a deep breath, biting her lip for a moment before recounting her story. I thought if I went to the bishop, he could do something himself. Anyone raised Catholic knows when you want something actually done, the bishop is the one you talk to. I noticed a curious pensiveness come over CK's face for a moment. I told him this whole story, and he told me he'd have someone look into it, but that I needed to go to the police as well. But I'm not doing that. Not to someone else. The same look. Regret, maybe? I couldn't place what this emerging dynamic was. Lavender took another deep breath, her voice taking on a slightly trembling quality as she continued. A few weeks ago, a new man came into the shop. He was nice enough, very interested in demonology and some other particular interests. Asked for some book recommendations. Something about him, though. I knew he wasn't looking for the mass market stuff that I peddle to college students. I took him to the back, where I keep more valuable materials. At the end of the day, he made a sizable purchase, plus a few obscure spell books and some other supplies, candles and herbs and the like. Nothing out of the ordinary. He just seemed like any other guy in the community. CK pulled out a small notebook and pen from his cassock, beginning to write as Lavender spoke. Every few days he came in, speaking with me. Something about him was just, I don't know, charming. He wasn't exactly a looker, but there was something about him that just clicked with me. After a week, he invited me to get a cup of coffee, and I accepted. It was a perfectly good time, even if the conversation kept going over the same subjects I work with day in and day out. He seemed knowledgeable and approachable. After an hour had gone by, we finally went our separate ways, but he suddenly asked if dinner might be out of the question. I told him I'd think about it, but even then, I wanted to accept. The intense scribblings from CK were audible. I tried to listen as sharply as possible to capture my own version of her tale. A few days later, that would be around 4 days ago, he came back into the shop. He spoke again at the counter, good conversation, but at a certain point his mood shifted. Not in a bad way, just intensely. This feeling came over me, a tingling almost, an energetic charge. Sounds rich coming from someone doubtful about all this in the first place. She gave an exasperated laugh, seemingly to relieve the anxiety which grew in her with every moment of the retelling. He looked into my eyes with this intensity and said such beautiful things about me, that I was special, that I had a gift. I noticed CK had stopped writing and was looking up at Lavender, one eyebrow cocked. After a moment, he looked down and continued writing. He said that from the moment he saw me, he knew that he could help me hone my ability to genuinely come into my own. Normally, I'd just dismiss that along with the other New Age whack that people try to say to me, but it felt so different coming from him. It felt real. She paused for a moment. "What did he ask you to do?" CK inquired. "He just asked me out to dinner again. Said we could go to his place after I closed. I couldn't find it in myself to say no. Of course, I had to accept. He was just... Perfect for you?" I asked. Lavender nodded. I could see her eyes becoming dewed. After I closed that night, he met me and we just started walking to his place. We didn't even converse that much. I just felt like I was on autopilot. We walked down the street aimlessly. How long, I don't know. It seemed like a fog came over my mind and my sense of direction. Even the normal lights of the city seemed to make way for the real fog, which became darker. Finally, I found myself in front of some random house. Nothing special, but somehow it was in the city. Or who knows where it actually was. I didn't really have a clue where we had gone, really. Tears finally came, slowly trickling out of the sides of her eyes, stained by the faint remnants of her eyeliner. He invited me in, and... CK looked at her intently, almost mad with sobriety. "What was in the house, Ezra?" "Ezra?" I thought, my mind racing with confusion. Lavender buried her face in her hands, audibly crying. Bodies, Father. Dead, decaying, laid out like some kind of... like a sacrifice, all on wooden altars. The heads, oh God, their heads. Father, they were on the corners of the altar. 4 of them, all women." My heart was racing, threatening to beat out of my chest. And in the room, somehow beyond what I could see, but still there all the same, I don't know, something evil and monstrous, several feet tall and robed in black hoods, with faces made of horrific animal skulls, dripping with blood, holding knives in bony, bloody, serpentine hands. And the man... God! She was sobbing at this point, overcome with terror and trembling. My hands were icy and wet. I suddenly saw through him. He wasn't a man, wasn't anything. He was bestial, monstrous, like them, but hiding it all behind his face. He just stared at me with lifeless eyes as he beckoned me forward. And I couldn't, Father. I couldn't go. I knew I had to get out, and it seemed that I finally came to my senses. So I ran out into the darkness, out into this fog of nothingness,
while everything in my mind told me that death was racing to catch me. She breathed, catching her breath, deep, laborious breaths. CK's face remained calm and cool. When did things become normal again? Sniffing, Lavender sought for words. I ran until I couldn't, and the fog was still so dense in my mind and on the street. I just wandered and wandered. Before I knew it, I was just standing there. She pointed to the front of the shop with a trembling hand. Kelly, Father, I called that night. I hated myself for making that call with every fiber of my being, but I knew I had to. The next day and the next, every day I called the bishop's office, and every day it was just another message, and I felt like it was the same thing all over again. But then yesterday, I was a bit busy in the shop, and suddenly the feeling came over me, like eyes in the back of my head, just pure terror, and I looked outside, and he was there, across the street, just smiling, staring at me. I knew I had to tell Joseph to his face, or nothing was going to happen. Nothing was ever going to happen. No one was ever going to believe me. Joseph. My thoughts were confused and wild. She called the bishop by his first name. Who was this woman? She looked down at the floor, seeming to collapse in the exhaustion she had weaved for herself in telling the story. I believe you, Ezra. Grey and I both do, CK said with a soft smile, reaching forward to grab her hand. We sat for a moment as Lavender collected herself. I have him on video. She cleared her throat, standing up. From the security cameras. Will that help? Please, CK said. Nothing can hurt at this point. Lavender walked to the back of the shop, entering the door to her stockroom. CK and I were alone for a moment as we sat in silence. CK silently made the sign of the cross, praying something under his breath. I did as well, finally needing to ask what had been on my mind for some minutes. Ezra? I said softly. Kelly looked at me with that same pensive look as before. Yeah, her real name is Ezra. It's the name her parents gave her, the name I first met her by when she was a newborn. It's the name I baptized her with. I looked at him incredulously. Her family? CK looked changed, not pensiveness, but genuine sorrow. Kid, sometimes... He cleared his throat and looked down at the floor, folding his storied hands together. In our work, there are times that you just can't save everyone. The door to the back room opened again as Lavender came out carrying a laptop. She set it on the counter. CK stood up, steadying himself on his cane as we both instinctively gathered around. This is from the first time he came in, she said, hitting play. It was a simple enough video, though silent. A man came in the store, his face obscured by the light, and approached the counter. He spoke with Lavender for a moment before she seemed to tell him to wait, and left to walk towards the back. Something about him, though, the build, the figure. CK leaned in, his face directly next to mine as we watched. I felt a sense of dread rise up inside me, and a cold sweat build up again. Grey, CK said softly, his eyes never blinking as he watched. The man in the video then turned, not facing the stockroom, but looking directly into the camera. Oh God, I whispered. CK yelled in anger, slamming his cane on the floor in frustration. On the screen, looking directly into the video feed, was a short, portly, middle-aged man. I recognized him in an instant. CK did too, and Lavender looked at both of us in shock. It was Dr. Mangrove. Harold. His name was Harold? I said to Lavender. She nodded yes, fear visible in her widening eyes. I looked at the screen again in disbelief. Harold seemed to peer directly into my eyes through the video. His face was as normal as when I'd first met him, but his eyes, you can always tell by the eyes. CK moved next to Lavender, comforting her as she began panicking over our recognition of the figure on the screen.
I continued to stare, taking in every feature in detail I could. It was unmistakable. The possessed figure in front of us was Dr. Harold Mangrove, the same man who had previously assisted us in the exorcism of the man in Chinatown. I slumped into an interior contemplation. Like most fields, the practice of exorcism is one which no amount of theory and study can properly prepare you for. You have to be dropped in, boots on the ground and running full speed, to truly understand it. My own short studies in Rome, done over the span of a few months and entirely limited to lectures and classroom practica, seemed to be woefully inadequate. CK and I had, for the second time in a month, stumbled across what appeared to be a genuine case. After composing ourselves from the reaction of seeing Harold in the security footage, we immediately conferred about his appearance. Even in my nautical state, and watching through the grainy, slightly unsaturated security footage, I could recognize the telltale signs in his eyes. Eyes are the lamps of the body, the words of Jesus himself in the Sermon on the Mount. If the soul is in darkness, the eyes will reflect it, and this is entirely true for the possessed. Like the possessed man in Chinatown, Harold's eyes were unnaturally piercing. His pupils seemed to be black holes, drawing everything in. The whites had become a characteristic off-white. Beyond that, the feeling which he imposed through those glances was something which the mind itself could somehow express. Animistic panic from the deep recesses of unconsciousness. The pervading feeling that those eyes belonged to something false, something only pretending to be human. Whether from a need to survive Neanderthalic encounters, or a prevalence of demons, or some other horror entirely. At some point in ancient days, before history was even written, our minds developed the recognition for such beings, those which appear to be human, but aren't. My heart raced with anxiety as we discussed the next step. If Harold was already in the full throes of possession, which CK had emphatically insisted, and was also regularly scoping out Lavender's store, then there was little we could do to keep him at bay. We had to get her somewhere safe, and the safest place in this instance would be the rectory. Lavender shut down her store, calling her employees and telling them that they needed to take time off for the next few days at least. After placing a firm "close" sign on the door, we began our trek back to St. Justine's, keeping our pace brisk. Others seemed to notice our speed, making way for us in between confused glances. Certainly the sight of two priests booking it down the sidewalk, side by side with Lavender McCoy, must have been quite a sight. By the time we reached the rectory, I was on the edge of exhaustion, yet CK seemed entirely unfazed. He threw open the doors, ushering us all inside before slamming them shut again. Lavender and I both collapsed into chairs in the living room, and I could hear CK in the back of the house, tossing his cane into the corner as he studied through the rummaging shelves before emerging and walking past the living room with a glass jar of salt? I asked incredulously. He stopped in his tracks, turning to Lavender and I with a face caught in full mania.
"Well, what the hell else would it be?" he said curtly, immediately turning and booking it out the front door. "Exorcised salt, Grey," he said, slamming the door shut again.
I stood up, walking over to the living room window and peering out into the yard. CK was walking the perimeter of the rectory, sprinkling a line of salt on the entryway. Ever so often he would stop, make the sign of the cross over the place he stood, and then continue on.
"It's his way," Lavender spoke with a deep sigh. "When things get serious, this is how he gets. Determined. Doesn't help that I'm involved either."
I decided to finally press the issue, still burning with questions as I sat back down in my chair and turned to face her. "What's the story with you two?" Lavender let out a short laugh, getting lost in thought for a moment. "It's not for me to talk about, at least not with you. Given the circumstances, he'll likely tell you when he's ready. Father to father, exorcist to exorcist." The front door flew open again and CK came through, closing it with just a touch more gentleness now that he had finished his momentary task. He walked into the living room, holding his noticeably empty jar of exorcised salt.
"Grey, my study."
As he walked back in haste, I stood up, pensively following as Lavender leaned back into the chair and closed her eyes. As I walked into the office, CK motioned for me to close the door. I obliged and sat down opposite him at the desk.
"Grey, we have a serious problem," he began, finally taking a deep breath as the frenzies of the morning caught up with him.
I nodded silently, preparing to take in CK's own observations. This doctor, CK gritted his teeth and rubbed his hands together. I made a mistake. My expression became undoubtedly quizzical. I've always made a point to check up on everyone after successful exorcism, even after a diagnosis. I remembered to check up on you, after all. He trailed off for a moment. I didn't check up on Dr. Mangrove. I just let him leave with you, and I'll be held accountable for it someday. CK, you did what you had to do. I was outside with him. I should have recognized something was off. If you have to blame someone, blame me.
No, son. CK leaned back, rubbing his eyes for a moment. You were green. Still are. It was my responsibility, and I failed to meet it. Somehow, one or more of the Legion must have gotten caught up with him. He must have wanted answers, but why didn't he reach back out to us when the signs started showing? Perhaps he didn't have time. Perhaps. But it's not common for things to progress so fast. Think about what the Legion was doing, Grey. Trying to wear down the family, I recalled, and doing it through suffering and possession.
Exactly, he shot back, leaning forward and looking me in the eyes. Whatever is happening now, whatever demon or demons are troubling this man, they're doing something different. He sat back again, looking down at his desk in thought. I just wish I knew what it was. We sat in silence for a minute, CK's glance staring off behind me. Turning to look, I saw his gaze fixed on an image affixed next to the door, recognizable to anyone with the knowledge of iconography. Our Lady of Perpetual Hope. Do you know why his shoe is dangling off? The shoe of the Christ child, CK asked. I thought for a moment and realized I had no idea and shook my head. Fear. The angel and the image, on either side, are presenting the instruments of the Passion. A cross, nails, the spear. The Christ child has leapt up into his mother's arms in fear, losing his shoe in haste. See how his hand grips her hand, pulling it closely as if to shield him. See her hand, supporting him and keeping him close to her. I nodded, observing the intricacies of the icon. Even his face shows that fear, and his mother's face is one of stout resilience, motherly love, but a knowledge of the inevitable, the sword that Simeon prophesied for her too. I turned back to CK. Why this image? He looked at me and gave me a slight smile. Sometimes I have to identify with the Christ child here. I'm afraid, Grey. Not for myself. I'm afraid because I recognize the instruments at play here. We have a duty to free this man's soul, but even then, if he's truly done the things that Ezra saw, well, like the image, fate is bearing down. I paused for a moment. CK, I asked Ezra about her relationship with you. He cocked an eyebrow at me. And? She told me to ask you, and that you'd tell me when the time was right. CK smirked and laughed softly. She was right, kid. He sat back up, adjusting his cassock and pulling out his notebook from the interview. So, I suppose I'll fill you in. Not right now, though. Though, accepting the answer, I gave a slightly dejected sigh. Grey, I have to call the chantry and yell at our most holy and blessed Bishop Joseph, his signature biting sarcasm coming back out. What about his recommendation to call the police? CK glared at me. No, not yet. I need to figure things out first before we do anything. I'm gonna take care of matters here, call the chantry, and get the processes started. I need you to take care of parish business. You'll have a noontime congregation assembling without a shepherd to keep them talking. I glanced at the clock on the side of the study and noticed the time, 1:15 noon. Daily Mass it is, I accepted, standing up and adjusting my cassock. Will you both be here when I get back? Kid, if I manage to go anywhere else within the hour it'll take you to get back, there'll be something truly wrong. He flashed me a short smile, which I returned, and stepped out of his office, walking towards the front door. Lavender, although I suppose I'd taken to thinking of her as Ezra at this point, sat sleeping in the same chair. Walking out across the front lawn to the door of the church, I could already see some of the daily mass attendees approaching. The Hendersons were walking up the sidewalk, a few elderly folks and families stepping out of their parked cars. Walking inside, I caught sight of a dozen or so other families already assembled. The Cambridges, the Montagnys, the biker couple who always managed to sneak out before I could catch their names. One of the funny things about parish ministry is that you very quickly develop a relationship with the usual crowd. I vested and celebrated without a hitch, joined at the altar by the studious young Jude Henderson. As I thanked him in the sacristy, after Mass, his dad, Brandon, announced himself with a short knock. "Hey, Jude," he sang, laughing at his son's instant embarrassment. "Come on, Dad," he bemoaned, "not in front of the father." I chuckled as he finished hanging up his cassock. Brandon walked in and we exchanged pleasantries with a handshake. "Hey, Father, got a minute?" "Of course," I replied in the midst of hanging up my own vestments. "What can I do for you?" He gave a quick smile and looked over at his son. "Hey, buddy, go out and hang with your mother. Gotta talk to the father for a second." Jude dutifully nodded and headed out, Brandon shutting the door behind him so that it was just the two of us in the sacristy. I continued to divest as I noticed Brandon trying to find his words. "Father, you know we live just down the way, of course." "Oh, yes," I replied, half listening as I slipped off my stole and maniple. "Well, it's just, I noticed you guys earlier. I mean, you and Father Kelly and Ezra." I was caught by surprise in the midst of taking off my flowing white alb, looking at Brandon through the lace for a moment. "I feel like this deserves some full attention, then," I told him, hurriedly removing the rest of my vestment and hanging it up. "I suppose you're curious as to what we were doing, but based on the fact that you called her Ezra, yes, Father, I may not have been here when it happened, but I'm familiar with her story. It's a story that enough of us share in some ways." "It's not mine to ask about," I dutifully replied, recalling both her and CK's words. "But if you have any worries, please. It's just that I want to know if there's something she's gotten involved in or something that's put her in danger. Father Kelly's going to do what it takes to get her safe, right? He will absolutely not let it rest. Don't leave his side. He's experienced, he's knowledgeable, but he's also human." I thought for a moment, wondering just how deep these relationships extended. "Thank you, Brandon. I'll keep an eye on him." He flashed me a relieved smile, reaching out again to quickly shake my hand as he walked back towards the door. "Remember, if you guys ever need anything, you're always welcome," he said, standing in the doorway for a moment. I smiled back at him as he walked out, shutting the door behind him. Realizing the extent of which CK and Ezra's relationship went, CK and everyone's relationship it seemed, I headed directly across to the rectory, firmly intending to help get things rolling as quickly as possible. As I walked into the rectory, I noticed that Ezra was no longer napping in the chair, and upon walking to the back, I noticed CK wasn't in his office either. My senses went on alert. If I managed to go anywhere else within the hour, then something is truly wrong. CK hadn't warned me of this exactly. Where the hell could he have decided to go? I looked into the alleyway between the rectory. My own little car was firmly parked where I had last left it, but CK's black 70s Continental was gone. I walked back to his study and sat down at his desk, thinking that maybe he'd left me some clue as to where he and Ezra had gone. Plain as day was a piece of scrap paper, and on it was written, "Gray, gone to the chantry. Drive over." I leaned back in the chair, taking in a small breath of relief. Yet, I was still unnerved by something. I sat back up, cautiously surveying my surroundings. CK's office was normal, decorated in the usual array of books, icons, and small crucifixes next to the desk. Something continued to nag at my mind, though, and that sense of anxiety was growing. Then I noticed the lights, ever so slightly dimmed, like I was viewing them through an invisible haze. I recalled the sight immediately, shooting up from the chair and taking in the totality of my surroundings. Even the light coming in from outside seemed dimmed. I felt as if I could see the faintest whisper of fog coming over the rectory. Thud! I shot my eyes towards the door, my heart skipping a beat. I had unconsciously shifted down into a semi-crouch stance, some instinctual fight or flight. That wasn't the sound of the door, I told myself, examining an off-looking spot on the wall. That was I peered over the desk, noticing the icon of Our Lady of Perpetual Help lying face down on the floor.
Thud!
Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the crucifix on the wall launch forward and land face down on the ground.
Thud! Thud! Thud!
Slowly, each icon, each sacred image fell one by one to the floor. Saint Benedict, Saint Lucy, Christus Victor, each landing below where they had stood. The lights grew dimmer still, and I noticed my skin begin to shudder with goosebumps. The otherwise warm autumn day had become quite cold, and I was beginning to make out the sight of my own breath. As I became cognizant of the growing sense of panic and fear, I felt an intense urge. Something was drawing me. I stepped towards the door to the study and pulled it open, walking out into the now pitch-black hallway. I could see faint light coming from the front of the rectory and slowly approached it. I was fighting with myself the entire way.
Stay there, you moron. What the hell are you doing? You've got to get to the door. You need to open the door. Don't open the door. Do not open the door. Run to your car. Open the door. Open the door. Open the door.
My hands had already turned the handle and begun slowly opening the front door by the time I realized what I was doing. Outside, the entire world had fallen away. A blanket of fog covered the neighborhood, which was quite eerie. Not a good sign. No birds, no traffic. You could have heard a pin drop. As I walked out of the rectory, I noticed that the fog formed a circle around it, keeping this one small area free of any fog. With a sudden rush of air and a sense of great pressure from behind me, the door slammed shut, and I found myself standing outside, exposed.
Ah, Gray.
A smooth, dreadful voice called in front of me.
That voice.
Slowly, the form of a man appeared before me, standing on the sidewalk just a few feet beyond the edge of the river fog. Short, portly, middle-aged. Harold. The name came curtly off my tongue. He was still the same man as the last time I'd seen him, but something else had changed about him. There was a calculating calmness to him. He was dressed in the same black cassock which I wore, but in apparent mockery, he wore an impossibly black collar with it. His eyes, though, they weren't demonic eyes. They still appeared to be his. "Harold," I spoke up, trying to remain calm. "Is that you? Are you the one speaking to me?" He grinned. "Oh, yes. None other than yours truly." His voice was not his own. The squealing accent which had grated my ears the month prior was gone, replaced with a deep, silken one, which seemed to echo off into the distance with each word. The accent, the wording, none of it was his. "Gray, we have business to attend to." I felt a jolt of confident command rise up in me. I was a priest, damn it. I was not going to let this demon command this conversation. "You're not welcome here. Be gone," I firmly stated. "Oh, Gray, fresh from your academy and hurling such fierce language, I would have expected more courtesy from you. You'll find none of that here, accuser." He seemed to wince at the title.
"Don't name me, fool boy."
His reply was short, precise. He regained his confidence.
"Gray, I just want one thing. Only one."
"I've got nothing for you, demon." He chuckled under his breath.
"I'm prepared to leave you be."
My eyebrows unconsciously rose.
"Oh yes, prepared to take myself back from whence I came. But..."
He seemed to lose any of his false joviality, suddenly becoming quite serious. The air around him grew frigid, and I noticed my warm breath entirely visible.
"Give us that bitch."
"Ezra," I replied.
"Oh yes, Ezra. We much preferred her name, her new name. We're sure she won't appreciate our father's name for her, We thought bitch was rather tame."
"Ezra is a child of God and under my protection. Out of my head, creature." He winced again at the title.
"Fortitude, damn it, fortitude. She isn't worth it, you chrism-scented, baby-faced piece of shit."
His face contorted in pure anger, losing all pretense of civility. Then I felt a piercing pain coming from the back of my hand, involuntarily pulling them up to my face to see what was happening. They were blistering red, steaming as if they had been placed in a cauldron of boiling water. On my palms I could see blisters appearing in the form of crudely drawn crosses, slowly popping and spilling out blood and water. In the midst of my pain, I could see Harold maniacally laughing. Chisholm, would it respond to my hand? Could I make it go away with a blessing? I raised my right hand in front of me, a gesture I had done 1,000 times, and began a blessing. Through blinding pain that radiated from my hand, I fought back. Harold seemed to sense it immediately. Endless death and unimaginable pain will be the consequences for this priest. Harold was entirely subsumed by the creature possessing him. The eyes changed in an instant, pupils blacker than night, whites the color of dried blood. I could see hate and anger well up in him, and beneath the human form, my conscious mind could see the bestial entity clawing its way into our world, hell bent on my destruction. I raised my hands up, preparing to make the sign of the cross. Harold leapt forward, landing on all fours and jumping towards me like a wild animal. His eyes, looking me dead on, were like those of a wild hog, a beast preparing to close in on its prey. I stood my ground in an instant, internally calling on God's aid, his angels, all the hosts, the power of heaven, as I prepared to begin whatever impromptu exorcism this turned out to be. Then, as suddenly as he had launched forward, Harold came to the barrier of fog, the line of exorcised salt which CK had made. A terrifying, inhuman scream shot through my senses, followed by a blinding light. Without thinking, I kneeled down and tried to shield myself, covering my ears and squeezing my eyes, which had somehow not escaped the radiant brightness that was brighter than the sun. I flew back, involuntarily sucking in a deep breath of air, and opened my eyes to find myself on the floor of CK's office. I shot up, my heart continuing to race as I took notice of my surroundings. The icons were still up. The crucifix was still up. I shot my glance to the window. No fog. It was a perfectly bright day. My hand, I pulled it up and saw that they were entirely normal. No pain, no welting. Was it a dream? I tried to collect myself for a moment, still panicking. The physical signs may have been gone, but everything in me screamed that what I had undergone was no dream. Something was too real about it. I needed to tell CK. I glanced down at the desk again and saw the same note as before. Gray, gone to the chantry. Drive over. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys, praying I hadn't wasted any time. I was going to fight.
I could feel my skin still flushing between the heat of belligerent anticipation and the cold dread of anxiety. My encounter with Harold at the rectory, whether a dream or a genuine vision, left me surging with adrenaline. A confrontation was coming. As I drove closer towards the center of downtown, where the chantry was located, the still shining sun was slowly replaced with looming shadows of concrete, metal, and glass. The temperature seemed to fall moment by moment as the buildings rose higher into the sky. I quickly slid into the first available parking spot next to the cathedral, ripping off my seatbelt and tearing out my wallet. I fumbled through it to find my celebrate, the small ID card issued to priest which, among other things, guaranteed the diocese parking warden wouldn't give me a tow the moment I left my car. In the midst of searching, I was startled by a sudden sound. Tap, tap, tap. My glance shot up, likely looking half crazed, as I eyed the man who had just rapped on my window. He was tall, portly yet well built. He leaned down to look into the car, an older man, more middle-aged than elderly, wearing a black polo and khaki shorts. Suddenly, seeing his face, emoting something between annoyance and concern, I realized who I was looking at. Bishop Joseph, I explained, suddenly realizing I was muffled behind the closed car door. He chuckled a bit, opening the door for me. Gray, he began, his deep voice practically resonating down the entire block. I was wondering when you might get here. I stepped out of the car, shutting the door and turning to properly greet him. Well, it was, a rather busy drive, Your Excellency. I hesitated a bit, remembering his reputation for being a bit casual. I thought it best to forego reverencing his episcopal ring, a sign of his office, lest combined with the cassock I was wearing, he mentally labeled me as troublesome and traditional. At the very least, I thought at the time, he would think I'd adapted well to living with CK. I see you've adapted to living with Kelly, he said with a chuckle, looking me up and down. I'm a broad church guy, Gray, to borrow a term from our English brethren. Come inside and get caught up on things. Turning towards the chantry, he gave a quick wave to the parking warden, who had already stopped outside to eyeball me. The warden gave a curt nod and walked back inside as Bishop Joseph gestured me around the block, towards the front of the cathedral. Although our pace was hurried, and the sight of the cathedral was nothing new to me, having been through it 100 times before, I was still enraptured by its beauty as we walked through the towering oak doors. The bright white interior was, even in the absence of direct sunlight at this hour, still bathed in the colorful radiance from the windows, a dozen spanning the length of the nave. They showed images from sculptures of saints and other signs and symbols. 4 marble side altars stood in place along the wall, each with a statue sitting on the reredos above it. Tall columns of soaring domes intensified the scale, all leading the eye to the unfortunately bare chancel, containing only a small table-style altar, a few chairs, and a lectern, consequences of a recovation some decades prior. "Funny how it always gets you, eh?" Bishop Joseph admiringly said. "Yeah, she's always been beautiful to me." "Me too," his voice took on a quiet, serious quality. "I see plenty of your brother priests just pass through here like she was nothing. So, it's just nice to hear you say that." He turned, walking left towards a sequestered room which held the baptistry. As I followed, he gave a quick sequence of knocks on the worn antique door, carved with the baptismal symbols. The door unlocked and opened, revealing a worried-looking CK. He quickly ushered us inside and locked the door behind us. The interior of the baptistry was richly detailed, almost Gothic in contrast to the sober interior of the church. Rich images adorned the puginesque walls, which were bathed in a soft blue light emanating from a large window portraying the baptism of Jesus. Sitting in a pew inside the marble baptismal font was Ezra, a look of anxiety on her face. I felt a familiar hand on my shoulder, and turned to see CK, an apologetic look on his face.
"Gray, I'm sorry for leaving you, but we had no choice."
"It's okay. I've been worried, but I'd just like to know what's going on." He gave a short nod, walking over to Ezra and sitting down next to her. Bishop Joseph spoke up. "The story she told you to matched the story she told me, down to the smallest details. So, it's a valid case?" I questioned. Bishop Joseph paused for a moment and thought.
"Oh, for the love of God," CK piped up. "Of course it's valid."
"I see the signs in her story as well as anyone else," Bishop Joseph interjected. "But the fact remains that you're asking me to approve a major exorcism from an entirely different person, a man you haven't even interviewed, only based on her story." CK shot to his feet in indignation.
"Explain the vision, then. Explain how you saw him."
My blood ran cold. "You saw him too?" I asked breathlessly. CK shot me a worried look, seeming to peer into my soul.
"Gray, something to add?"
I took a breath, slowly recounting the dream I'd experienced at the rectory. With each detail, it seemed as if both CK and the bishop were becoming acutely alarmed. Ezra, listening intently, eventually leaned over and buried her face in her hands. Exhaustion covered her every expression. I finished my story, feeling exhausted by the telling. CK and the bishop shot each other glances. "I saw the same thing," Bishop Joseph revealed. "This morning in my residence, I was sitting on my couch, reading through the prayers of today's Mass when I noticed the lights looking odd." "And the fog?" I inquired. He gave a solemn nod. "The man asked me the same thing as you, except..." He paused, rubbing his hands together in a moment of anxiety. "He knocked at my door, walked into my foyer, the entire house filled with a choking fog."
"We need to bless your house again," CK quipped. "The chantry too, most likely. Demons shouldn't have been able to do that. Your scumbag predecessor clearly sinned the place out of any protection."
The bishop gave an exasperated sigh, throwing up his hands in a moment of resignation. "I am firmly aware, which is why we both agreed to hold this meeting in the cathedral instead of my home." The bishop cleared his throat and continued with his story. Each time he spoke, he became more and more enraged. He seemed to be transforming, changing into something. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. I thought he was going to kill me right then and there. I couldn't run, couldn't scream, so I just prayed. Prayed the one thing I remembered that I thought could help. From the old Mass back in my childhood. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. And, like you said, a blinding light, a scream. I jolted up and was suddenly sitting in my chair again. I thought it was just a dream, but... He trailed off for a moment. After Mass, I got a phone call. He looked towards CK, and the pastor had just experienced the same thing. I shot my glance towards CK. You too, huh? He nodded at me. Right after you left, I went to sit with Ezra for a moment, and all the telltale signs started up. The same dreadful set of tricks. I walked right out the front door expecting you. Demons love trying to set the mood, kid. Don't let 'em. Saw him materializing right outside that salt circle. Real tough guy move. I slowly smiled. What did you say to him? The same things? Of course not. It knows I'm not about to give up anyone for the sake of being left alone. The demon knows it's a lie. I know it's a lie. And the demon knows that I know. So, what did he say? Oh, nothing unusual. He was gonna kill you, kill the bishop, drag Ezra by a hair to the fires of hell, yada yada yada. Come back to infest the parish with a legion and drive me insane. The usual cacophony of BS. The bishop shot him a glare, which he returned with a dismissive roll of his eyes. Did he just leave? Did you have to fight him off? Oh, we made a big show of poisoning himself like he was going to attack me then and there. Didn't mean anything, though. I woke up back in my chair after I told him to take his ass off back to hell where he belonged. Calm it down, the bishop warned. This is a house of God, and I won't have you swearing in it. CK put his hands up for a moment, diffusing the situation. Apologies, Your Excellence. Just wanted to give him all the details. Ezra suddenly shot up from her chair, her face red and her eyes streaming with tears. Kelly, you know he's avoiding the issue. She stared at the bishop. Please, Bishop Joseph, let him and Father Grey take this case. Don't make the same mistake Langford made. CK seemed to grimace the moment the name passed Ezra's lips. Ezra, please, CK calmly said. Bishop Langford, I thought. How does Langford factor into this? Bishop Joseph sighed, looking down at the floor for a moment. There was a great silence, and after a few moments, in utter frustration, I spoke up. For the love of God, would someone please tell me what's going on? I boomed. CK and the bishop looked at each other for a moment in silence, seeming to affirm a mutual decision. Ezra touched CK's arm, and he turned to look at her. Kelly, please, she quietly asked. Father Grey deserves to know. CK nodded soberly, sitting down in a pew next to the font. Ezra followed, still wiping tears from her eyes as she sat down next to him. Please, he quietly told the bishop, sit down. We joined them in the pew, sitting on either side of CK and Ezra. I had never seen CK in this state before. Absent of his usual sarcastic bravado, he seemed to have developed an atmosphere of resigned vulnerability, resting his arms on his knees and looking towards the baptismal font for a moment. I could see his lips moving, uttering some prayer known only to himself and God. Finally, he sat back up, adjusting his cassock and beginning to speak. Being an exorcist has changed over the years. Changed a lot. I didn't start out as an exorcist, of course. When I was ordained back in '48, I spent damn near a decade sitting between 3-year stints in different parishes. Being a pastor took ages then, plenty of priests to go around. Different world than the one you're in, Grey. He glanced over at me, and a look of fatherly affection crossed his face. It was in 1959 that I finally received a curious call from Bishop Hodges, Lord rest him, to come to an ambiguous meeting at the chantry. As it turned out, he was assigning me to shadow our team of exorcists. There were 3 back then, good men all of them, Arthur, Victor, and Chester. Still remember them well, still pray for them every day. Hearing CK recount this time in his life struck a chord with me. He seemed so natural, so confident in his words, and I hadn't quite considered that he was once a student too. The years went on, bishops came and went, Hodges passed away,
Whitmore passed through on his way to a red hat at the archdiocese. Then the clock struck 1972, and he came. I could hear his disdain biting through. "Langford," Bishop Joseph said with a frustrated sigh. "Langford," CK said sharply, the name shooting off his tongue like a hot coal. "Young for a bishop, and cool. The committee tried to butter us up before we got him, but I wasn't a moron. I knew, pretty much all of us old-timers knew, what had been happening in the seminaries. The laxity, the willingness to let anyone through in the name of progress." Bishop Joseph sighed in frustration. Looking over at him, I could see his figure slightly slumped, mirroring CK's own resignation. 30 years, CK sighed. "For 30 years I bit my tongue, stayed in my parish, did my work. Every time he tried to resign me out of some ministry, I fought like hell, taking it up as far as Rome. When they told him to cut it out, just leave the poor old exorcist alone, he took that to heart. He never assigned me a single apprentice. I called on my brothers from the old days when I needed to, but the slow march of time eventually took them all to the Lord. Langford did what Rome told him to. He left me alone." He leaned forward and removed his glasses, staring ahead at the font and contemplating. I could see a faint mist in his wrinkled eyes, which he promptly wiped away, putting his glasses back on before sitting up straight. "Spitting in the face of my work wasn't enough either. He had to spit in the face of my ministry, of our ministry. The whispers started after a few years, then they grew into rumors, and finally became threats directed from him. There were plenty of badly taught priests in that time, not malicious, just ignorant. They may have frustrated me, but they held down assignments. Others, though, moved to a new place every few years, constantly avoiding clergy events, driving away their flock with their inexplicable reasons, rushed announcements about lasciviousness every year, committals to St. Dymphna, sudden decisions to enter distant monasteries. Langford was an evil man, shocked at the candid statement which Bishop Joseph had made. Nothing can make up for it, not a damn thing. When it all came to light 6 years ago, after he had retired and been installed, his last act of insult to the faithful, after abusing them, hiding those who hurt them, and destroying their churches, was to die before they could see justice. CK made a short, hushed laugh and looked towards me. "Gray, I need you to know what kind of man he was. You have to understand it for everything to make sense. He wasn't just hiding criminals and heretics. He was a criminal and a heretic. He didn't believe, which is why, before Rome demanded he leave me alone, he tried everything he could to interfere." There was a pause, and in the silence I noticed a heaviness in my chest, anger, profound sadness. "It's all true," Bishop sighed. "Every bit of it. When the Vatican assigned me here and told me how horrendous things had become without them realizing, it didn't take long to get sense of the work that needed to be done. I've tried, I truly have. I've lascivized criminals, helped prosecute them, tried to be as transparent as possible. You've done well," CK admitted. "I give you crap. I do it because I'm still angry about it all. But you funded my parish again, promoted my work. You even assigned me an apprentice." He glanced at me for a moment, beaming. Then he turned back to the bishop. "I just don't understand why you can't trust me in this matter." "Kelly, it's not for a lack of trust. It's the inescapable sense that the situation is beyond us. All I want, and I don't see anything beyond a cursory similarity to the incident the story is leading up to, is to inform the police that there may be a murderer involved in this. Just get one cop to follow you along. Some of them are parishioners. I know one of them would be willing." This is why CK is having this reaction, because he doesn't want a cop following us. "CK," I interjected, "what's the story? Why are you so opposed to this?" "It's about my parents," Ezra nodded. "That's
what this has all been about. I shot a quizzical look at CK. He met it, gave a short nod, and after a moment of thought, proceeded to tell me the rest of the story. Ezra's parents, Matthew and Josephine, were originally members of St. Justine's. I married them there, baptized Ezra there, gave her first Holy Communion. But then, Langford set out to break my parish, and he relied on his usual threats. He sent letters to the younger families at St. Justine's, telling them they had been canonically transferred to his new experimental faith community in the suburbs, Agua Vida Catholic Community. Never mind the fact that he had no right to do that, never mind that you can't mandate which parish someone attends, and never mind that every single one of those failed experiments resulted in pain and massive apostasy. CK sighed, regaining his composure. He told them that refusing to attend the community would be a mortal sin. A liar through and through, Bishop Joseph spoke up. Yeah, but it worked. Families tearfully said their goodbyes, including Ezra's. But they kept in touch. Matthew was less than impressed with the laxity of the place. Josephine wasn't crazy about the priest either. She was teaching Sunday school and she loved it. Everything was going well, at least for a while. Ezra had turned 13 and I had the chance to attend her confirmation. Then, Josephine stopped writing, stopped calling. This was in '86. A few months went by and my work kept me too busy to stop and check in. Then, the night of the Pentecost Sunday, I got a knock at the rectory door and found Matthew standing outside with a look of panic, Ezra at his side. I remember it, she said quietly. I invited him inside and he told me what had happened to Josephine. She had gone into a depressive fit and tried to take her own life. Slit her wrists, you see. They'd brought her back from the hospital and she was resting, but Matthew had learned Josephine had told him why she had done it. She was hearing voices. A chill crept up my spine. They started just before she stopped writing me. She had an experience which, in the moment, destroyed her sense of truth and belief. The priest at their community had always been friendly, but especially to Josephine, always coincidentally showing up at the same time she was preparing materials or lessons for her Sunday school class. But he went from being friendly to being downright flirtatious. I could hear Ezra sniffling and looked over to see her weeping again. One day, he confessed he wanted her, tried to convince her that she wanted him too. She refused, but he wouldn't stop. He tried to kiss her, tried to do more. She hit him, knocked his sorry ass to the ground, but then he became angry. He left her alone, but started publicly shaming her, blaming her even though she was the victim, claimed she came on to him, calling her a whore and a harlot. Mom loved the church, Ezra spoke up. She and Dad both, but this destroyed her. A man she was supposed to trust, supposed to confide in, a man she called father. Turned out he was anything but. And the voices? I asked. Was he possessed? CK thought for a minute. Truth is, kid, I doubt it. I think it was probably entirely psychological. When someone's world gets torn down like that, the mind can be pretty unforgiving. So, what did you do? I made a mistake. CK cast his glance downward. I sent Matthew back home and told him I'd be over the next day. Then I called Langford and I was just so enraged. All my anger came spilling out. I told him that his new priest had done something, screamed at him for destroying the screening and formation process, and told him exactly what I thought of him, said I was going to expose every bit of his horse crap. What did he do? Oh, he was perfectly cordial at first,
Smug little bastard. Told me how he cared about my anger and wanted to make things right. Somehow he talked me into having a cop come with me to their house. Claimed it was just for our safety. She was suicidal after all, he kept saying. I felt off about it, but I eventually agreed. You didn't know, Father Kelly, Ezra said through tears. You couldn't have known. That doesn't make it any easier or any less my fault, Ezra. I should have called him. I noticed Bishop Joseph's face contorting in a mix of sadness and anger. The next day I showed up at their house a bit early, hoping to give her some comfort before the cop arrived. We sat in her kitchen at the table and had coffee. She told me everything and, between bouts of crying, thanked me for coming. I heard her confession, gave her the anointment of the sick. Matthew and Ezra came in and joined us afterwards. We told stories, even tried to laugh. It was a beautiful moment. Then the door flew open. CK was looking intensely ahead, his fists clenched tightly together. I didn't recognize the cop. He was older, dark glasses, shaved head. I motioned Ezra away from the table and stood up, walking over to him. And as soon as I was out of the way, he just... His voice became frail and broken. He started screaming at Matthew and Josephine. Drop the knife. Step back. Stop. This is your last warning. I was confused, turning to look at them as they jumped up in fear. Things seemed to happen so slowly. Their faces were somewhere between confusion and terror. Matthew had put his hands up, and I saw Josephine's eyes grow wide. I looked back at the cop and saw him draw his gun. I started to yell, realizing why he'd been yelling, to fool anybody listening from the outside. I remember my hands lunging forward, but it was too late. He shot them. My heart sank, and I could feel anger welling up inside me. 2 shots each, right in the heart. Bang, 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 CK screamed, his frail, loud voice echoing through the baptistry. Ezra pulled her knees to her face and began crying profusely. I looked back, and they were gone, on the floor, bleeding out. Time seemed to be returning, and I realized I had fallen to my knees. I felt cold metal on my forehead, and I looked up to see him peering over me, his mouth contorted in a sick smile. He said to me, "I'm not afraid to kill you too, old man." His voice was so cold, heartless and calculating. "Forget what you saw here. Forget what she told you. Get off back to your little church and pretend they've gone to heaven." I felt frozen and afraid. I stood up and saw Ezra sitting in the corner of the kitchen, staring at her dead parents. I couldn't just leave. I asked him what he was gonna do. He holstered his gun and laughed. "Langford didn't pay for the girl. Now get on out before my backup gets here." CK buried his face against his hands. So I did. I left. I drove away just as a dozen cops pulled in and flitted into the house. And when I walked back into the rectory, still in a stupor, I found a note on my desk. "Don't cross me again." CK began to cry, his frail, storied voice pouring out pain. I realized I was weeping as well. A stream of sorrowful drops fell from my face, plunked onto the stone floor of the baptistry. Ezra started forward, her eyes seemingly emptied. Bishop Joseph was bent over, staring into the floor with a look of horror. For a few moments, we all sat in the dismal silence, punctuated only by sobs from the most resilient man I had ever met. After a moment, CK straightened up, his wrinkled face burning red. I put my hands on his shoulder, trying to provide some sort of comfort. He looked at me, eyes still wet. "Gray, sometimes demons are just men, wicked, evil, fallen men, and we can't exorcise that."
Exorcism is not a field solely rooted in the metaphysical or the supernatural. It's also intimately human. It is the crossroads between human lives and deep ancient darkness which lurks in the oldest roots of creation. We stand in a perpetual fray between these two worlds, in places carved out by magnificent and heinous actions before history was ever written. Even the lasting knowledge and imprint of those events left on the human soul could not be expressed in its fullness, coming instead through epic tales written by ancient men at the edge of history. Tales of the diverse goodness of creation, the temptation for us to place ourselves in a fundamentally unobtainable station, and great cosmic warfare which span the division of boundaries and reality. The inquiries into these first principles is, in the end, the study of one thing: evil. Evil does not sleep. It's always brooding, always lurking in the dark. It may lay undisturbed for ages, but it does not sleep. It waits, patiently and dutifully. Our duty, a charge we accept freely, is to take action when it finally strikes. There are rules governing its action, fundamental principles built into reality. Over time, we come to know and understand them, at least on some level, but they still remain mysterious. We see through a glass darkly. One truth, perhaps the most persistent, is that evil cannot abide someone to peer into its depths, and yet continue to live outside its grasp. Many people can be clutched tightly and pulled in, losing themselves to the abyss. Fair game, in other words. Others, however, have to be led. Such a person may be greatly impacted by evil, even move into a whirlpool of its influence after witnessing it. But so long as they live without being fully in its grasp or its liability, one may have more power than they realize. When Ezra witnessed the murder of her parents at such a young age, the murder put into action by a man who was supposed to be the successor to the apostle, and committed by a man who was supposed to be respecting justice and peace, it ripped her worldview apart and placed her into a whirlpool of evil's grasp. She forsook her faith, her friends, and anything else which reminded her of the life which had been torn away from her. Yet her soul, still indelibly marked, sought spiritual life in some other way. She fed it with whatever seemed opportune or available, catering to the lifestyle of the perpetual spiritualist seeker. She changed her name, burned her bridges, and began to live a different life. Yet, even as a woman named Lavender fell deeper into a violent maelstrom, that indelible mark, a soul which CK had named Ezra in the waters of baptism, resisted and fought. She could not be pulled in directly, only edged closer to the abyss. Evil knew the liability at hand. Were Ezra to escape its clutches, freeing herself of the yoke which had been placed upon her, her words and testimony would prevent untold numbers from possibly falling to the same fate. Even if her escape meant just one other person could be defended from the clutches of evil, that would be too much for it to abide. At a certain point, being stirred from its waiting, evil decided the time had come to seal her fate. It could not pull her in, but it could wear her down, in small ways and in great ways. Many of these things were explained by CK as we all sat in raptured silence in the baptistry. Others I had to infer after the fact. Still others I have realized over time. In that moment, however, only one realization cast itself over my mind. We need Ezra to be with us, CK spoke from the silence. I was jolted back, believing that he had somehow read my mind. Yes, she's the target, I quietly replied. We can't do anything without her. We both looked towards Bishop Joseph, still directing his worried look towards the baptismal font in the center of the room. Ezra sat downcast, listening but exhausted. The sun had ceased to light up the room, casting all of us in a muted shadow as the last glow of light faded moment by moment. I'm not Langford, he whispered, his gaze unmoving. I don't know what else I can say. I'm not
operating a criminal cabal under my belt. I'm not funneling money to mob cops. I just want... He sat up, looking towards CK, his face intent and serious. I just want assurances. I've never seen anything like this before. I've just learned to trust in God, in the church. I believe it's just a difficult time.
You have faith, CK spoke up. Have a little faith in me. If Harold has killed, we need to take care of the demonic before we let someone take care of the criminal. My only worry is that mingling those goals will result in tragedy, even if you don't intend it.
The bishop nodded slowly, standing up and walking over to the door. The baptistry was nearly shrouded in darkness. As he opened the door, the hazy light which still remained in the cathedral shone through to illuminate us. I agree, but there's more you need to know. CK glanced up. Follow me, please. Bishop Joseph walked out, heading down the nave of the cathedral. CK begrudgingly stood, grabbing a bottle of holy water out of his cassock pocket and sighing with a slight frustration. He waved Ezra and I on, following the bishop. You okay? I asked Ezra. She nodded, standing up and taking a deep breath. Facing the maelstrom, Father Grey, so let's get it over with. She sprinted after CK, catching up with him as I followed. We were led to a door on the left of the transept of the cathedral. The hallway within it opened up into an office of the chantry, which had long since closed for the night. Walking through the maze of offices to the back, we were greeted with another door, sturdier and older than the rest, bearing the diocesan seal above the words, Bishop's Residence. Fetching a key from his pocket, Bishop Joseph opened the door to reveal a small vestibule which opened up into a large, ornate parlor. A white, baroque-covered ceiling sat above the walls of a blue and beige damask. Bookshelves and paintings adorned the room, providing a rich smell of Bibleismia and antique mahogany. Welcome to my borrowed home, the bishop said with a small smile. A bit much for me, but she is lovely. He waved us through to an adjacent room. Looking over, I could see CK with his bottle of holy water, beelining to the corner of the room and sprinkling them. He ran off into another direction as Ezra and I followed the bishop into the adjacent room, containing a grand staircase and a large oak door leading to the street. In the distance, I could hear CK's shoes tapping throughout some distant room as he imparted a whirlwind of blessings to the house. Bishop Joseph led us through a small final door on the other side of the staircase. It was smaller and more clearly lived in. The ceilings were the same decorative style, but the walls consisted entirely of built-in bookshelves. A few chairs sat in front of the desk and around the wall of the room. On a large desk in the corner of the room was a faint lamp illuminating scattered books, ledgers, and a large PC. The sun had since gone down, leaving the warmth of the lamp our only source of light. Your office? I inquired. I like to think of it more as a study, Bishop Joseph replied, walking behind his desk and thumbing through the drawers. Easier to do the heavy lifting in here and save the office work out in the chantry for my simpler duties. He pulled out a small folder and looked up quizzically at Ezra and I. Where's Kelly? Ezra cracked a smirk. Re-blessing your house, I believe, she said. Kelly. In my study, Kelly, Bishop Joseph hollered. The pitter-patter of elderly feet suddenly became louder as a frazzled-looking CK walked in behind me, holding an almost empty bottle of holy water as he caught his breath. Right here, Your Excellency. Just finishing up. He flicked his bottle towards the corner of the room, exhausting the remainder of the water and tucking it back into his pocket. Bishop Joseph opened the folder in his hand, spreading the papers across his desk and waving us over to look. Photographs were paperclipped to the four of them. They appeared to be mugshots. When I heard your story, Ezra, something stuck out to me. Something I couldn't quite place until I remembered the reports from our homeless ministry. Catherine, she runs the ministry. She came to me about a week ago, mentioning that a few of the regulars had disappeared. Word on the street was that they were just disappearing, each on different nights. 4 women, the element of your story that struck me. He unpaperclipped the 4 photographs, passing them to Ezra. Her hands began to tremble as she studied each picture. In an instant, she shoved them back into the bishop's hands, walking over and collapsing into a chair. She leaned to the side, resting her head on her hands. Though upset, she seemed to have no tears left to cry. "It's them. Their faces. The heads I saw on the altar. It's them." CK and I looked towards the bishop. He sat the pictures down and picked up the papers he had scattered on the desk. I reached out to Lorenzo, a parishioner who's also a detective with the city PD. CK quickly frowned. I didn't give him any info on the case, the supernatural portion at least, but I did ask him to acquire any information the PD has on these women. For better or worse, they've each had a rap sheet, prostitution charges mostly. "You running a ministry or a prison pipeline?" CK replied. "A ministry," Bishop Joseph retorted. "I've asked Lorenzo and my other parishioners on the force to cut them a break. We try to provide them paths out of it, but at the end, it's only them that can help themselves. I'm not in the business of judging or punishing them." CK visibly relaxed a bit, giving a sobering nod. I let Lorenzo know that I might have someone with some information on their disappearances, but I stressed it was only a possibility. He agreed to keep it under wraps for now, but even if Harold is possessed, and if he's the culprit in the first place, he's going to have to answer for this. I have to bring it to Lorenzo's attention sooner or later. CK nodded again, standing up to his full stature. "Delegate me to perform this task. I'll bring him back if it is indeed him." Bishop Joseph thought for a moment. He seemed like a man caught between two duties, the spiritual care of a man who may or may not be possessed, and the temporal duty to bring justice to a man who may or may not be a killer. "It's yours. God be with you, and be careful." We began planning immediately. CK's mind seemed on fire, realizing everything we needed to do to prepare for the confrontation. A return to the rectory was first on his list, for supplies and much-needed rest. He needed to do research as well, putting the clues of our experience into some discernible context. The bishop concurred with his idea, silently listening in as we concluded our short meeting. He finally saw us out of the front door, thanking us for coming to see him. "As soon as you know more, come to see me immediately." CK shot him a thumbs up and a smile as he fetched his keys from his pocket. "You've got my word, Your Excellency." Bishop Joseph closed the door, waving us goodbye. The city lights illuminated us in a bright fluorescent glow as CK fetched his keys. "Ezra, you're with me. Grey, I trust you can follow us without getting lost." I chuckled, pulling out my own keys. "I'll try my best not to tailgate you." CK returned the laugh and led Ezra to his car. I walked a few paces up the street to where I had parked and tried to focus my mind as we began our journey back to the rectory. All the knowledge which CK had given me so far, in addition to the contents of my lessons in Rome, had been very different from the current case we now found ourselves on. It seemed that there was supposed to be a method to the madness, a pattern which was usually followed. Even the case which began this ordeal followed that order, so why was Harold so different? Harold seemed to have bridged the gap between infestation, oppression, obsession, and possession. Elements of each were present in the facts of the case, but there didn't seem to be any clues as to how they had grown. Harold was not a bedridden chasm of despair and anguish for those around him. He seemed to be active and mobile. He wasn't suffering from physical torment at the hands of demons, but seemed to be in some bizarre symbiosis with them. Had they infested him after the exorcism in the apartment? Had he somehow opened himself up? He seemed to admit to me before the exorcism that he was a non-believer. What purpose would demons have to infest him if he had no faith to destroy? Was all this directed towards finally pulling Ezra into their grasp? A thought entered my mind, something which I was unable to shake, no matter how hard I tried. What if CK is as lost as I am? I slowed down at the facade of St. Justine's, following CK's car around to our lot in the back. He exited the car with a brisk energy, opening the back door of the rectory for Ezra and waving me through as I climbed out of my car. Come on, we have work to do," he ushered. CK led us through the house, turning on the lights in the living room. He threw some logs and kindling into the fireplace as Ezra and I sat down. I recognized his energy in an instant, committed and ready. He had the authority he needed, and now he was going to stop at nothing to fix this mess. After the fire had caught, he stood up, brushing off his hands as he walked to the bookshelf. looking through and pulling at a few different selections. The books appeared to be worn and aged. I could hardly make out any of the markings or words on them. He sat them down gently on the small, round end table beside his usual chair. "I have some reading to do. Ezra, you can take the guest bedroom. It's just upstairs across from my own room. Gray can show you. Both of you need sleep. I'm not sure when I'll wake you up, but be ready to go when I do." I stood up, suddenly realizing how exhausted I had become over the day. Ezra seemed to barely have the strength to walk up the stairs. Looking back as we ascended, I saw CK immediately flip open one of his books, scanning the pages with an academic ferocity. I ushered Ezra to the guest room, simply furnished, but the bed was already made. "Thank you, Father," she said quietly, closing the door as soon as she'd entered. I made my way to my own room and found it just the way I had left it this morning, a time which seemed like ages ago given the day's events. I hung my cassock on the small coat rack next to the closet door, wrapping my collar around it. I changed clothes, even putting on a new pair of socks to sleep in. I was going to be as prepared as possible, firmly expecting CK to come in at any moment and tell me it was time to get to work. I glanced at my watch, noting the time was just past 8 o'clock. Grabbing my breviary from the bedside table, I prayed the short night hour, compline to end the day. Et lessum benedictum fructum ventris tuo, nobis post hoc, exilum ostende, O Clement, O Pia, O Delusio, Virgo Maria. I lay down, being transported the moment I pulled the comforter up into the void of dark sleep. No dreams, no thoughts, just the timelessness of sleep's veil, no sense of any other reality. Suddenly, an acute awareness flooded over me. It was like the beginning of a dream, when things are ever so slightly surreal. I was in no discernible place. Rather, it was more like a state. I felt fear welling up in me, hatred pressing in around me, a sense of doom and languish, which made me feel as if I were a prisoner bound in chains, unable to see anything but keenly aware of some malevolent despair, the absence of any light, any goodness. Around me I felt a growing familiar sensation. Something began to dance across my skin, giving short licks of sensation, both familiar and alien. What was it, I wondered? It was right there, just beyond my ability to recall. Flame. My senses shot to their fullness, losing any semblance of a dream. In pitch darkness, surrounded by the same sense of oppression, fear, and hatred, I suddenly became engulfed in a feeling of fire. I felt myself screaming, but no sound came to my ear, no strain in my throat. Everything was still, silent, peaceful. It was as if I could do nothing, as I was slowly consumed, reconstituted, and consumed again. Every part of me felt as if I were being destroyed and recreated in an unending immensity of torture, endless death, unimaginable pain. Protect us, Lord, as we stay awake. Watch over us as we sleep. My mind could only go back to my earlier prayer, begging protection from whatever was assailing me, that awake we may keep watch with Christ. My mind felt as if I were slipping, giving it a sensation of finality, falling into madness by forcibly accepting the permanence of my state. And to sleep, rest in peace. My eyes could see a wooden ceiling. My skin, pouring sweat, could feel the comforter surrounding me. My ears heard my breath hyperventilating in and out of my lungs. I was back. I was safe. Gray! I shot up in fear, the familiar voice coming from just beside me. Adrenaline ran through my veins as my heart pounded through my chest. Frantically looking around, I could see no other forms revealed by the soft glow of light outside. Yet the feeling remained, unshakable, that something had been there. Knock, knock. I screamed, jumping out of bed in a state of desperate panic as the bedroom door flew open. "What in the hell is wrong with you?" CK yelled, jumping back from the open door in fright. He leaned himself against the frame, bracing and taking a few deep breaths. "CK, I'm so sorry. I was having a thing." "Some thing, kid," he laughed, standing back up and catching his breath. "You scared the hell out of me." He looked at my face curiously, and I realized I must be drenched in sweat.
Gray, did you have a visitation?
I nodded, still breathing heavily. Not as visual as earlier. Something else. A sense. He tapped his temple with 2 fingers.
Fortitude, Gray. It knows we're coming out and it's lashing out. Don't let it wear you down, he said,
placing his hand on my shoulder in comfort. Down the alley, I heard a door creak open. Looking, I saw Ezra pensively glancing down at us.
Everything okay? She asked. Just fine. It's time to move out. Get ready, please. Wear something warm.
Ezra nodded, shutting her door. CK turned and made his way to his room.
I'm getting my supplies. Bring your ritual, a surplice, and a stole. Dress warm. I'll explain the situation downstairs.
I walked into my room and turned on the lights, relishing its mere existence for a moment. My heart had calmed down from the panic of my experience, and I was certainly wide awake. I buttoned my collar and threw on my cassock, looking through the closet for a warm coat to wear over it. I glanced at the time while putting on my shoes. Just past 2:30 in the morning. Outside my room, I could hear Ezra's door open and close, then the sound of her walking down the stairs. I stood up, took a deep breath, and followed. CK stood in the living room by the fireplace, already vested in his surplice and taking up the last remnants of heat from the dying blaze. I smelled the faint aroma of coffee and turned to see Ezra walking out of the kitchen with 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to me with a smile. I'm not much of a coffee drinker, but Kelly made some for you, too. I sat my coat and surplice on the chair nearest to me and took the mug, relishing the first sip of energetic warmth. Kelly did the same, quickly slurping it down sip by sip. Around his chair, I could see dozens of books on the table and floor, some opened, some closed. Has he been up this whole time, I wondered, taking another sip. So, what did you learn? I began. CK gulped the last of his coffee, taking a deep breath and setting the mug on the mantel.
It's not good. Most of the recent materials and texts speak the same way about accidental repossession. When the exorcised demon tries to infest someone else present at the exorcism, it's very uncommon and it usually takes the same route, throwing the person into the same litany of symptoms as the previously possessed person.
But Harold doesn't like that.
Right. Something is different. I had to go back pretty far, digging and digging. I started seeing footnotes and citations about willing repossession, something I've never quite heard of before.
I was surprised. CK, of all people, encountered something completely new.
Luckily, I had one of the texts cited. It's a reprint of a medieval demonology in Kyridian. Took me long enough just to read the damn text. God bless the poor blind monks who transcribed it. A willing repossession is analogous to an intentional conjuring, only after the fact.
So, summoning a demon? I asked curiously. But Harold didn't even believe. Why would he try conjuring?
He didn't, kid. Hence, after the fact, one or more of the Legion, probably one, likely the most powerful, moved on to Harold. He trailed off for a minute. The thing about legions, Gray, is that they're loud. A chorus of damned angels all seeking their own destructive outlet, like a symphony of screams which can't discern anything. They're powerful, but they're short-sighted little shits. Most of the time, individual possession is just about destruction, but sometimes you get a demon with some self-awareness, some sense. I think in this case, freed from the cacophony of the Legion, the demon became quickly aware of the potential to cause complete chaos.
Because of Ezra? I asked.
No, Ezra quietly replied. Not just because of me. Because of Kelly. And because of you.
My mind suddenly came back to Brandon's concerns warning the previous day.
Father Kelly is going to do whatever it takes to keep her safe. He'll probably not let it rest. He's experienced, he's knowledgeable, but he's also human. Gray, the demons knew me. I told you that much. They know my experience and my reputation, but over enough time, they also learn your fears, your doubts. They know I blame myself for what happened to Matthew and Josephine. They know I blame myself for Ezra falling from faith.
Kelly, Ezra teared up suddenly, seeming to realize what he was saying.
Exactly. If they pull you in, they know it will pull me in. Fortitude be damned.
He struggled for a moment, emotions flaring through his face.
If they pull me in, they think it's a clean shot to take care of you, Grey. 3 souls in perdition, 2 of them exorcist. They would risk a hell of a lot for it.
So this demon, it's aiming for this perfect storm of an opportunity, right? How was Harold involved in making it happen?
CK cleared his throat and continued to explain. An intentional repossession means that at some point, Harold willingly accepted what was happening. He either realized after the exorcism that he was possessed, or the demon slowly influenced him to seek out occult resources and darken his soul to the point that he thought he'd done it himself, unaware that the demons had been guiding him the whole time. Either way, the result is the same: possession. Then comes the willingness. The demon isn't tormenting Harold. They seem to be operating together. It likely made some sort of offer to him, some promise. The medieval Enchiridion says that acceptance of this promise creates a relationship, a covenant.
Then what about the content of Ezra's experience? The murdered women, the blood altar?
Ah, yes, that's elsewhere, but clear as day. The 19th century occult manual describes the dark ways of conjuration. In this case, a soul for a soul.
The souls of women?
No, their souls are free from all this. They'll face God and make an account, as will we all. Only he knows what is to become of them. The soul being exchanged is Harold's. Each murder he willingly commit is a grievous mortal sin. It cries out to the heavens for vengeance. It fractures his soul, bringing him deeper into the clutches of the evil one.
I sat down, my heart racing as I tried to take it all in.
Each death, each fracture of his soul, allows another demon closer access to this world. Those are the figures you saw, Ezra, hooded and animalistic. They were representatives which your mind tried to put together. You're simply incapable of seeing what they truly are. The images you created are far more tolerable than the reality. They're what's waiting to be ushered into this world.
But demons prowl the world already, CK. Why go through all of this?
Demons prowl about, yes, but there's no order to it. No goal but general destruction. Most demons are just foot soldiers. They're like parasites, latching on when they see the opportunity. They have limits, though. Grace repels them. One of the simplest prayers can defeat them. Before they grow, these are more damned seraphims, cherubims, thrones, still raging with insolent fire from their immediate rebellion. These are summoned with intent to be placed into something or someone through use of black arts. Grace, prayer, all of these things can be circumnavigated in this situation, especially by a conjurer who is willingly possessed. With us out of the way, they could cause horrific desolation, spiritual and physical. I can't say more, Grey. That's all I know. Only Harold can tell us more, and it's time he did so.
The clock in the living room began to ring, plucking out the chimes of 3 o'clock.
It's time,
CK said, pulling a violet stole out of his pocket, kissing it and placing it over his neck. He grabbed his small bag from behind the chair and double-checked the contents. I knew from experience what would be inside. Books, sacramentals, crucifixes, holy water.
We cannot find where he is hiding by any human means. His house, though it exists somewhere, is much more now. It is periphery, a liminal space between two worlds. We could stand before it and it would be hidden from all our earthly sight. We cannot use human skills or a black art to find it. God will show us the way to this battle.
I stood up, vested in my surplus and pulling my own violet stole out of my pocket. Rede mihi, domine, stolum immortalis, quam perdi in prevaceratum primi parentis, et quamvis indelict essentus et tum, sacrum mysterium, meritemen gaudium septerium. I kissed the stole and placed it over my neck, putting my coat on over it. Ezra had bundled up as well in a heavy hooded coat, a look of intensity on her face.
We'll walk aimlessly wherever our feet take us, and we will pray.
He pulled out his right, flipping to the back.
Saint Joseph is a powerful intercessor, Grey. We'll begin with his litany.
I nodded, walking over and opening the door. As we exited the rectory, I noticed that the night was cool, though not at all frigid. The sky was clear, a few stars peeking through the lights. Not a soul was in sight.
Ezra, did he take you deeper into the city, or further away?
Further away, I think. CK nodded, walking down the pathways from the rectory and heading left down the sidewalk, away from the city center. He began praying the litany, Ezra and I making muffled responses.
Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Christe adu nos, Christe exudo nos.
We walked at a steady pace, not paying attention to anything but our footing in the increasingly dark streets. CK took time between each invocation, spreading them out.
Secte Joseph, oro pros nodis.
In the distance, I could hear a car driving, though it was hidden from my sight. Business and buildings turned into houses and neighborhoods. Occasionally, street lights and yard lights lit our path. The cool air, which had been manageable at first, took on a deeper chill over some time.
Felili de nutrisse, or pros nobis.
A scattering noise came from alongside me. My glance shot over. A small possum ran through the yard away from us. I heard a small hoot from a nearby tree. Just an owl. The sky grew darker, and the stars grew brighter. Beside me, I could see Ezra with her hands buried in her jacket pockets. Her hood fully covered her head. The slightest mist blew out of her mouth with each breath.
Joseph justame, ora pros nobis.
We turned, our path walking past blocks of different neighborhoods. As we came towards the top of the hill, I could see a suburban sprawl. A mountain grew in the distance, the faint light of a quarter moon hovering just over the horizon. I became completely cognizant of our distance, our location. I had never seen this neighborhood, and the hill didn't seem to make much sense. Our area was relatively flat. A drive to the city seemed to have no change in elevation.
Exemplar ofricum, or pros nobis.
We descended the hill, the sky growing darker with each step. The streetlights became fewer and fewer. I noticed a chill creep up my spine. Something seemed off. Ezra put her arm around mine, pulling herself close. I could hear her voice quivering from the cold with each response she made. Looking at her, I noticed her breath seemed to mist slightly more than before.
Protone exusium, ora pros nobis.
Looking above, I could see a cloud moving overhead, followed by a handful more. They began slowly obscuring the black, starry sky. I shot my gaze to the left, thinking I had seen something. A wisp of fog, maybe.
Patron morentium, ora pros nobis.
I could see just below my vision the sight of my own breath fogging up in a cloud. I found myself uncomfortable, beginning to shiver. CK stalwartly marched forward.
Terror dominem, ora pros nobis.
From each side, it seemed as if a veil began to slowly descend. Clouds raced to cover the sky, completely blocking it out. Fog began to seep into our vision, rolling across the homes and yards. Our breath was entirely visible, curling up before us in bulbous clouds.
Agnus Dei, que tollis peccata mundi, parce nobis domine.
The road ahead disappeared, blanketed by thick vapors which surrounded us. The only light came from a steady fluorescent haze which permeated it.
Agnus Dei, que tollis peccati mundi, mercero nobis.
Our sight became entirely blocked. CK, only a few steps ahead of us, was barely visible. We marched on, deeper into the oncoming fray. Constitut uim dominum domus suis, et principum omnis professionalis suis. CK stopped in his tracks, motioning for us to keep up and join him. As we stood together, surrounded by choking fog, he spoke. "Here we are, Gray." He turned to his left, looking into the distance beyond the sidewalk. I followed his glance and saw it, a single house. It was still obscured by the fog, yet the structure seemed to permeate through it, as if it were existing in two worlds at the same time, visible to my eyes and visible to my soul. There was nothing special about it, nothing to set it apart from any of the other suburban homes. Yet at the same time, the sight filled me with a deep and unspeakable dread. I felt Ezra tighten her grip, pulling herself closer towards me. "That's it," she faintly whispered. "That's the house." CK bowed his head for a moment, muttering a short prayer under his breath, then turned to Ezra and I. "It's time we finish this." He turned again to the house, taking a single step onto the property. "God, help us."